Here's the thing about the world's first cities. They didn't last. Around 5,000 years ago, humans built something they'd never built before. Real cities. Not villages, not camps. Cities with thousands of people, stone walls, temple complexes, trade networks stretching hundreds of miles. And then they vanished. Not all at once, not everywhere. But again and again across human history, the first cities rose up and then collapsed. Sometimes slowly, sometimes catastrophically. Sometimes they were abandoned so completely that later civilizations had no idea they'd ever existed. This is a story about those collapses, about what happens when the most complex thing humans have ever created just stops working. About the patterns that repeat across different times and different places, about what our ancestors built, lost, and sometimes built again. We're going to look at real cities, specific places where you could have walked through streets and markets and temples, places where people lived and worked and raised children and worried about the harvest, places that are now buried under sand or jungle or simply forgotten. The Bronze Age cities of the Eastern Mediterranean, the Maya cities of Central America, the Indus Valley cities of ancient Pakistan, Mesopotamian city-states, early Chinese urban centers. They all followed similar paths, they all face similar problems, and they all teach us something about what happens when civilization reaches too far. If you're using this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. Here's what makes this fascinating. These weren't primitive experiments. By the time most of these cities collapsed, they'd been running for centuries, some for over 1,000 years. The people living in them had never known anything else. Cities were normal, permanent, the way things were supposed to be, until they weren't. We have the archaeological evidence now. We can see the layers, the sudden abandonment, the gradual decline, the burn marks, the unfinished construction, the empty streets. We can read some of their writing. We can trace their trade routes. We can analyze their bones and figure out what they ate, how healthy they were, how long they lived. But here's what we can't always answer. Why did it happen? What pushed these complex, successful civilizations past the breaking point? Was it climate? War? Here's the thing about the world's first cities. They didn't last. Around 5,000 years ago, humans built something they'd never built before. Real cities. Not villages, not camps. Cities with thousands of people, stone walls, temple complexes, trade networks stretching hundreds of miles. And then they vanished. Not all at once, not everywhere. But again and again across human history, the first cities rose up and then collapsed. Sometimes slowly, sometimes catastrophically. Sometimes they were abandoned so completely that later civilizations had no idea they'd ever existed. This is a story about those collapses, about what happens when the most complex thing humans have ever created just stops working. About the patterns that repeat across different times and different places, about what our ancestors built, lost, and sometimes built again. We're going to look at real cities, specific places where you could have walked through streets and markets and temples, places where people lived and worked and raised children and worried about the harvest, places that are now buried under sand or jungle or simply forgotten. The Bronze Age cities of the Eastern Mediterranean, the Maya cities of Central America, the Indus Valley cities of ancient Pakistan, Mesopotamian city-states, early Chinese urban centers. They all followed similar paths, they all face similar problems, and they all teach us something about what happens when civilization reaches too far. If you're using this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. Here's what makes this fascinating. These weren't primitive experiments. By the time most of these cities collapsed, they'd been running for centuries, some for over 1,000 years. The people living in them had never known anything else. Cities were normal, permanent, the way things were supposed to be, until they weren't. We have the archaeological evidence now. We can see the layers, the sudden abandonment, the gradual decline, the burn marks, the unfinished construction, the empty streets. We can read some of their writing. We can trace their trade routes. We can analyze their bones and figure out what they ate, how healthy they were, how long they lived. But here's what we can't always answer. Why did it happen? What pushed these complex, successful civilizations past the breaking point? Was it climate, war, disease, internal collapse, or something we haven't even considered? Different cities fell for different reasons, but the patterns repeat. The warning signs show up again and again, and that's what we're going to explore. Not just what happened, but what it means, what it tells us about how civilizations work, how they fail, and whether the collapse was really an ending or just a transformation into something else. Because here's the thing about those first cities, they failed, but the idea didn't die. Humans kept building cities. We're still building them. We live in them right now, and the lessons from those ancient collapses are still relevant, still urgent, still worth understanding. So let's walk through those ruins. Let's see what they built and what they lost. Let's figure out what really happened to the world's first cities. Let's look at what actually survived, what we can touch and measure and analyze. Because the physical evidence tells a story that written records never could. When archaeologists dig into these ancient cities, they find layers, literal layers of time compressed into earth. And in those layers, you can see the moment everything changed. Take the Bronze Age cities around the Mediterranean. Around 1200 BCE, something happened. Fast. Within maybe 50 years, over 40 major cities were destroyed or abandoned. Mycenae, Pylos, Tiryns, Knossos, Ugarit, Megiddo, Hazor. The list goes on. And here's what's strange. The destruction layers show fire, lots of fire, but also something else. Unfinished construction, half-built walls, abandoned repair work. Like people were trying to fix things right up until the moment they gave up. At Ugarit, on the coast of Syria, they found something haunting. A tablet in the oven where it was being baked. Still there after 3,200 years. It's a letter. A desperate letter. The king is writing to someone asking for help. The enemy ships are already in sight. The city's army is somewhere else, fighting a different battle. There's no one left to defend the walls. The letter never got sent. The city burned. Everyone either died or fled. And Ugarit was never rebuilt, never reoccupied. It just ended. That tablet tells you something about the speed of collapse. This wasn't gradual decline. This was sudden catastrophe. The kind where you don't even have time to finish baking your emergency correspondence. But not every city shows that pattern. Some tell a different story. Look at the Indus Valley cities. Harappa, Mohenjo-Daro. These massive urban centres in what's now Pakistan. They lasted for about 700 years, from roughly 2600 BCE to 1900 BCE. At their peak, they might have housed 5 million people total across the whole civilization, and then they declined, but slowly, very slowly. The archaeological evidence shows gradual abandonment. People didn't run, they left over generations. The buildings got shoddier, the drainage systems stopped being maintained, The writing disappeared, the trade networks shrank, but there's no massive destruction layer, no fire, no violence, just slow entropy. By 1900 BCE, the great cities were mostly empty. People had moved to smaller settlements, simpler lives. The urban experiment was over. What happened? Nobody knows for sure. But the evidence points to environmental change. The rivers shifted course, the monsoon patterns changed. The land that had supported those massive cities couldn't do it anymore. And here's the thing about gradual collapse, it's almost harder to understand than sudden destruction, because it means people watched it happening. Generation after generation, things got a little worse, the city a little emptier, the buildings a little more run down, and they just adapted, accepted, eventually left. The Maya cities show yet another pattern. Tikal, Copan, Palenque. These weren't built in river valleys like Mesopotamian cities. They were jungle cities, built in one of the most challenging environments on Earth. No rivers for easy transport, no metal tools, no draft animals, just human labour and incredible engineering. And they worked. For over 1,000 years they worked. The classic Maya period ran from about 250 CE to 900 CE. Massive stone temples, complex water management systems, sophisticated astronomy, writing, art, mathematics. The collapse came in waves, different cities at different times, but the pattern was similar. Between 800 and 900 CE, the major centres were abandoned, not destroyed. Abandoned. Walk through Tikal today and you see temples rising out of jungle, but you also see something else, unfinished monuments, construction that stopped mid-project, like someone just put down their tools and walked away. The evidence suggests multiple factors: drought, warfare, soil exhaustion, political fragmentation. But here's what the bones tell us. The people who lived through the collapse were stressed, malnourished, shorter than their ancestors. They were struggling. And yet the cities didn't burn. There's no massive destruction. People just stopped maintaining them, stopped building, stopped gathering in the ceremonial centres. The jungle took over. Within a few generations, the great plazas were covered in trees. Now look at Mesopotamian cities, the very first urban centres, places like Ur and Uruk and Lagash. These cities rose and fell multiple times. Some lasted thousands of years. Some collapsed and were rebuilt. Some shifted location as rivers changed course. The evidence here is complex because we're looking at such a long time span. From about 4000 BCE to 500 BCE, you see cycles. Cities rise, cities fall, new cities appear, old cities are abandoned, but certain patterns emerge. When archaeologists dig into these sites, they find evidence of environmental stress, salt build-up in the soil from irrigation, changing river courses, deforestation, the land degrading from overuse. They also find evidence of warfare, lots of warfare, burned gates, destroyed walls, mass graves. These cities fought each other constantly, competition for water, for trade routes, for farmland, for prestige, and they find evidence of social stress. In the later periods, the gap between rich and poor grew. The temples got bigger while the houses got smaller. The rulers' tombs became more elaborate while common graves became simpler. Something was breaking down. The social contract that held these cities together was fraying. Chinese cities show similar patterns. The early urban centres along the Yellow River, places like Erlitou and Zhengzhou. These cities rose during the Bronze Age, around the same time as cities in other parts of the world, and they face similar challenges: environmental stress, warfare, social complexity. The evidence shows periods of growth and periods of abandonment, cities that lasted centuries and cities that barely lasted a generation. But here's what's interesting about the Chinese case. The urban tradition didn't die. Cities kept being built. The idea survived even when individual cities didn't. There was continuity even through collapse. So what does all this evidence tell us? What patterns emerge when you look across different times and places? First, cities were fragile. More fragile than the people living in them probably realized. They required constant maintenance, constant input of resources, constant social cooperation. When any of those things broke down, the city broke down. Second, collapse came in different forms, sometimes sudden and violent, sometimes slow and gradual. Sometimes cities were destroyed, sometimes they were just abandoned. But the end result was the same. The urban experiment failed. Third, environmental factors mattered enormously. Every single one of these civilizations faced environmental challenges: drought, flooding, soil exhaustion, deforestation, climate change. The cities depended on their environment in ways that made them vulnerable. Fourth, warfare accelerated collapse but rarely caused it alone. Cities that were already stressed became targets. Weak cities got conquered, but strong cities could survive attacks. The violence was often a symptom, not the root cause. Fifth, social complexity created its own problems. The more complex the city, the more things that could go wrong. More people to feed, more systems to maintain, more potential points of failure. Complexity was both the city's strength and its weakness. The physical evidence also tells us something else, something about the people who lived through these collapses. They didn't give up easily. At site after site you see evidence of attempted repairs, reinforced walls, emergency construction, efforts to keep the city functioning. At Mycenae, they built a secret underground cistern late in the city's life, a massive engineering project to secure water during siege. It didn't save the city, but it shows they were trying. They saw the danger, they worked to prevent it. At Maya cities, you see evidence of agricultural intensification, terracing, more intensive farming, efforts to squeeze more food from degraded land. It wasn't enough, but they tried. The evidence suggests that people didn't just passively watch their cities die. They fought to save them. They adapted, they innovated, they tried new solutions, and when those failed, they tried other solutions. But eventually, for each of these cities, there came a point where trying wasn't enough, where the problems were too big, where the solutions required more resources than they had, where the only rational choice was to leave. And here's what the evidence shows about that moment. It wasn't always obvious. At many sites you see continued occupation right up until the end. People living normal lives, making pottery, raising children, trading goods. And then suddenly, nothing. The gap between normal life and total abandonment could be shockingly small. A few years, maybe a single generation. The city that had stood for centuries could empty in a lifetime. What we can measure now, with modern archaeology, are things the ancient people couldn't see. We can analyze pollen to track deforestation. We can measure isotopes in bones to see dietary stress. We can trace trade goods to map economic networks. We can read climate data from ice cores and tree rings. And all that evidence points to the same conclusion. These collapses weren't mysterious. They weren't acts of angry gods or cosmic punishment. They were the predictable result of systems under stress. Systems that had grown beyond their sustainable limits. Systems that couldn't adapt fast enough when conditions changed. The evidence is there, in the dirt, in the bones, in the ruins, in the unfinished construction, and the abandoned tools and the layers of ash. It tells a story of human ambition and human limitation, of what we can build and what we can't maintain, of cities that rose like miracles and fell like dominoes. And the most important thing the evidence tells us, this wasn't ancient history. This was human history. Our history. The same species, the same brains, the same capacity for creation and destruction, the same tendency to push systems until they break. The ruins are still there. You can visit them. Walk through streets that once bustled with life. Stand in temples where thousands gathered. Touch stones that were carved and placed by hands just like yours. And if you're quiet, if you really look, the evidence speaks. Not in words, but in patterns, in warnings, in lessons that are still relevant today. There's something perfect about that. Ancient cities that collapsed thousands of years ago, helping modern people across the world find rest. The ruins serving a new purpose, not shelter anymore, not commerce, just peace. Now, back to those ancient streets and what they can still teach us. You wake up in Uruk around 3000 BCE. The sun isn't up yet. Just grey light through the doorway. Your house is small, one room, mud brick walls, a reed mat on the floor where you slept. Your back hurts. The floor was hard. You stretch, stand, walk to the doorway. The street outside is narrow, maybe 6 feet wide. Houses pressed close on both sides. The walls lean in. You can almost touch both sides if you stretch your arms. It's quiet. Too early for most people, but you hear something. Footsteps. Someone else is awake, walking somewhere with purpose. You step outside. The street is dirt, packed hard from thousands of feet. It smells like dust and smoke and something else. Garbage, human waste. The city doesn't have sewers. People throw waste into the streets, into designated areas. Sometimes you walk. The street curves. Uruk wasn't planned like a grid. It grew organically. Streets wind and twist. Dead ends appear. Alleys branch off. You've lived here your whole life. You know the paths. Strangers get lost. Other people emerge. Doors open. The city wakes up. A woman carries a water jug. Heading to the canal, a man leads a donkey. The animal's hooves click on the hard ground. You reach a wider street. This one was planned. It leads to the temple district, the Eanna complex. You can see the ziggurat from here, a massive stepped pyramid. Mud brick painted white. It catches the first light, glows. The temple employs thousands, priests, scribes, craftsmen, labourers. It owns land, controls trade, redistributes grain. The temple is the economy, the government, the centre of everything. You're not going there. You turn down another narrow street, heading to the workshop district. Here's what archaeologists found when they excavated Uruk. Houses packed tight, streets barely wide enough for 2 people. No windows facing the street, just blank walls, doors. Everything turned inward. Privacy mattered, or security, or both. The houses had courtyards, open to the sky, rooms arranged around the courtyard. That's where life happened. Inside, protected. The street was just for a movie between places. They found workshops, areas where specific crafts clustered, potters in one district, metalworkers in another, weavers, basket makers, leather workers, specialization, division of labor, the hallmark of civilization. They found temples, not just the big ones, small shrines scattered through neighborhoods, local gods, household deities, religion woven into daily life. They found trash heaps, layers of broken pottery, animal bones, food waste, the detritus of urban life. Archaeologists love trash. It tells them what people ate, what they made, what they threw away. They found tablets, thousands of clay tablets, Most are administrative records, boring stuff, lists of grain, counts of sheep, rations distributed, debts owed. But these boring tablets tell us everything. They tell us the city worked through writing, through bureaucracy, through record keeping. You reach the workshop. It's a pottery. You're an apprentice, learning the craft. You've been doing this for 3 years. Your hands are strong now, stained with clay. The master is already there. He's older, maybe 40. That's old in Uruk. Most people don't make it past 30. Disease, injury, childbirth for women, infection. The city is crowded. Diseases spread fast. You don't greet him. You just start working. There's a pile of clay, needs to be wedged. You knead it, press it, fold it, work the air bubbles out. Your hands move automatically. You've done this thousands of times. The master works the wheel. It's a simple device, a flat stone disc. He spins it with one hand, shapes the clay with the other. His movements are fluid, efficient. He's made tens of thousands of pots. You watch when you can. Learning. The wheel is new technology, maybe 100 years old. Before that, people coiled clay by hand, built pots ring by ring. The wheel changed everything, made production faster, more uniform, better. Other apprentices arrive. The workshop fills. 6 people working, the master, 4 apprentices. 1 labourer who hauls clay and wood for the kiln. Nobody talks much. The work is repetitive, meditative, hands busy, mind elsewhere. By mid-morning the sun is high. The workshop is hot. Clay dust hangs in the air. You're thirsty. Someone brings water. A boy, maybe 10 years old. He works for the temple, brings water to the workshops, gets fed in return. You drink. The water tastes like the canal, slightly muddy, slightly sweet. You're used to it. The master examines the pots, checking quality. He rejects some, smashes them back into the clay pile. No waste. Failed pots become new pots. He marks the good ones. A seal, his mark. This pottery came from his workshop. Reputation matters. Quality matters. Trade depends on trust. Think about what this means. This man has a reputation. His mark has value. People across the city know his work. Some of his pots travel down the Euphrates to other cities. His reputation travels with them. This is civilization. Not just cities, not just buildings, but systems of trust, networks of reputation, economic relationships that span distances. You work until afternoon. Your back aches. Your hands are sore. The master nods. You can go. You're done for the day. You wash your hands in a bucket. The water turns grey with clay. You walk home through streets now crowded. The city is fully awake, alive. The market district is chaos. People everywhere, shouting, haggling, trading, goods laid out on mats, grain, dates, fish from the canal, cloth, pottery, tools, jewellery. Some transactions use silver, weighed on scales. Most use barter or credit. The temple keeps records. You can draw against future rations. The system is complex. It works. You see a scribe, sitting cross-legged, tablet in his lap, stylus in hand, recording a transaction. 2 men arguing over the price of barley. The scribe is patient. He's seen this before. He'll see it again. Scribes are elite. They can read, write, calculate. They train for years, start as children, memorize hundreds of signs, practice on clay tablets. Most wash off. Practice again. Only the best survive the training. The scribe settles the dispute. He records the agreement. Both men mark the tablet with their seals. The deal is done, recorded, official. The tablet will be filed, stored, maybe forever. You keep walking. Past the temple complex, the Iana is massive. Walls 30 feet high, decorated with cone mosaics, thousands of coloured clay, cones pressed into the mud brick, creating patterns, zigzags, diamonds, beautiful and labour-intensive. Inside the complex are courtyards, temples, storehouses, administrative buildings. Thousands of people work here. You can hear the noise, scribes calling out numbers, workers moving goods, priests chanting. You don't go in, you're not important enough. The temple is for elites, priests, high officials, wealthy merchants. You're a potter's apprentice. You stay outside. You reach home. Your family is there. Your mother. 2 younger siblings. Your father died 2 years ago. Fever. It took him in 3 days. Your mother is weaving. She makes cloth, sells it in the market, trades it for food. Your siblings help. They're learning. Everyone works. You eat. Barley bread, onions, dates, sometimes fish. Today just bread and onions. It's enough. After eating, you sit, rest. The afternoon is hot. The city quiets. People retreat indoors. Wait for evening. You think about nothing. Just sit. Watch dust motes in the shaft of light from the doorway. Listen to the city sounds. Distant voices. Donkeys braying, dogs barking. This is life in Uruk. Work, eat, rest, repeat. It's not dramatic, not exciting, but it's stable, predictable. The city provides structure, order, security. Here's what's remarkable. This life, this daily routine. It's completely different from anything that came before. Your ancestors were nomads, farmers. They lived in small villages. Everyone knew everyone. Life followed seasons, harvests, migrations. You live in a city of maybe 50,000 people. You don't know most of them. You'll never know most of them. You work for someone you're not related to. You buy food you didn't grow. You live in a house you didn't build. You follow rules you didn't make. This is new. This is civilization, and it works because of systems, writing, bureaucracy, law, trade, division of labor, specialization. You don't think about these systems. They're invisible, like air. You just live within them. Evening comes, the city wakes again. People emerge, the heat breaks, the streets fill. You walk to the canal. Many people do this. The canal is social space. People gather, talk. Children play in the water. Women wash clothes. Men discuss business. You sit on the bank, watch the water. It's brown, slow. It carries silt from upstream. That silt makes the land fertile, makes civilization possible. Someone sits near you, a neighbor. You nod. He nods. You don't talk, just sit. Watch the water, watch the city. The sun sets. The sky turns orange, then purple, then dark. The city lights up. Small fires, oil lamps, cooking fires, thousands of small lights. The city glows. You walk home. The streets are dark, dangerous. You stay to main paths. Walk quickly. Home. Your family's preparing to sleep. The fire is banked, embers glowing. You lie down on your mat. Close your eyes. Tomorrow will be the same. Work, eat, rest, repeat. This is what the first cities were. Not monuments, not temples, not great achievements. Just this. Daily life. Ordinary people, doing ordinary things in an extraordinary new way. Living together. Thousands of people, strangers, following rules, creating order, building something bigger than any individual. That's the revolution. Not the buildings, not the technology, the social organization, the ability to coordinate, cooperate, create systems that let strangers trust each other. You fall asleep. The city continues around you, never fully quiet, never fully dark, always alive, always moving, always becoming. Now let's look at the Indus Valley. Same time period as Mesopotamia. Same basic idea. Cities. Thousands of people. Complex society. But completely different. The Indus Valley Civilization appeared around 3300 BCE, lasted until about 1300 BCE. That's 2000 years, longer than Rome, longer than most civilizations we think of as ancient, and we barely know anything about them. Here's what we do know. They built cities, huge cities. Mohenjo-daro had maybe 40,000 people. Harappa was similar. Dozens of smaller cities, hundreds of towns, thousands of villages. The civilization covered 386,000 square miles. That's bigger than ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia combined. They had writing. We found over 4,000 inscribed objects, seals mostly, clay tablets, pottery. The problem? We can't read it. Nobody can. The script has about 400 signs, short inscriptions, usually just 5 or 6 symbols. We don't know what language it represents. We don't know what it says. Without writing we can read. We're missing everything. No king lists, no myths, no laws, no literature, no administrative records, just silence. So what do we have? Buildings, streets, artifacts, the physical remains. And those remains tell a strange story. Visit Mohenjo-daro in 2500 BCE. Walk through the streets. The first thing you notice is the planning. The city sits on a grid. Streets run north-south, east-west. They intersect at right angles. The main streets are 30 feet wide. Side streets are 9 feet. Alleys are 5 feet. Everything measured, everything precise. Compare that to Uruk. Uruk grew organically. Winding streets, dead ends, chaos. Mohenjo-daro was planned. Someone designed this city before building it. Someone enforced that design for centuries. The houses are brick. Fired brick, not mud brick like Mesopotamia. Fired brick lasts. It's harder to make, requires more fuel, more labour, but it's permanent. These bricks are still here 4,500 years later. The houses are similar, not identical, but similar. 2 stories usually. Rooms arranged around a courtyard, a well in many houses, private wells, individual water supply. And here's what's really strange. Bathrooms, private bathrooms, with drains. The drains connect to sewers, covered sewers, running under the streets. The sewers have inspection ports, manholes. Someone maintained these systems, cleaned them, kept them working. Think about this. Mohenjo-daro had better sanitation than London in 1800 CE. Better than most cities until the 20th century. In 2500 BCE, the streets are clean. Archaeologists found trash bins, public trash bins, placed at regular intervals. People used them. The city stayed clean. There's a citadel, a raised platform 40 feet high. Flood protection maybe, or status, or both. On the citadel sits a large building. Archaeologists call it the Great Bath. It's a pool, 39 feet long, 23 feet wide, 8 feet deep, waterproofed with bitumen. Steps lead down into it. Rooms surround it. Nobody knows what it was for. Ritual bathing maybe, purification, or just a pool, a public bath. We don't know. Here's what's missing. No temples, or at least nothing we can identify as a temple. No palaces, no massive royal tombs, no monuments to kings, no statues of rulers, no victory scenes, no warfare depicted anywhere. In Mesopotamia, temples dominated, ziggurats, palaces, royal tombs filled, with treasures, art showing kings, conquests, power. The Indus Valley has none of that. They had trade, extensive trade. Indus seals show up in Mesopotamia. Mesopotamian goods show up in the Indus Valley. Ships crossed the Arabian Sea. Traders moved between civilizations. But we don't know how it was organized, who controlled it, how it worked. They had weights, standardized weights, found across the entire civilization. the same weight system in every city, every town, precision weights, carefully calibrated, someone enforced standards, someone checked. But who? They had seals, thousands of seals, usually showing animals, a bull, an elephant, a rhinoceros, a unicorn. That last one is interesting. The unicorn appears constantly. It's not a real animal, it's a symbol. Of what? We don't know. The seals have writing. Those short inscriptions we can't read. They were used to mark goods, seal containers, indicate ownership maybe, or origin, or contents, standard bureaucratic stuff, but without reading the script we're guessing. Here's what archaeologists found in houses: toys, children's toys, little clay carts, animals, whistles, gaming pieces, dice, board games. People played, children played, normal life. They found jewellery, beads, necklaces, bangles, made from carnelian, lapis lazuli, gold, copper, beautiful craftsmanship, tiny beads, drilled precisely, strung in patterns. They found tools, bronze tools, copper tools, stone tools, pottery wheels, kilns, workshops, evidence of every craft you'd expect, metalworking, pottery, weaving, bead making, all the specialization of civilization. They found art, small sculptures, the famous dancing girl, bronze, 4 inches tall, she's dancing, one hand on her hip, wearing bangles, confident, beautiful, or the priest king, soapstone. He's wearing a robe, a headband. He looks calm, dignified. These aren't gods, they're people, just people. What they didn't find is inequality, or at least not much. The houses are similar sizes, similar layouts, no massive mansions, no slums. The graves are similar, simple burials, few grave goods, no royal tombs, no treasures. This is weird. Every other early civilization had massive inequality. Rulers, elites, commoners, slaves, pyramids for pharaohs, palaces for kings. The Indus Valley seems different, more equal, or at least less unequal. Maybe there were rulers, maybe they just didn't build monuments, maybe power was expressed differently, through trade, through administration, through religion we don't recognize. We don't know. The civilization lasted 2,000 years. That stability, that success. The cities stayed on the same grid plan for centuries. The standards stayed consistent. The trade networks held, something's worked, and then it ended. Around 1900 BCE, the city started declining. People left, moved to smaller settlements, rural villages. The urban centres emptied. By 1300 BCE, the civilization was gone, the cities abandoned, the writing forgotten. Why? Climate change, maybe. The rivers shifted, the monsoons weakened, agriculture failed, or invasion. Though there's no evidence of conquest, no burned cities, no mass graves, or disease, epidemics. We don't know. The people didn't disappear. Their descendants are still there. Modern Indians, Pakistanis. The genetic continuity is clear. The culture continued, just without cities, without writing, without the complexity. Here's what's fascinating. The Indus Valley and Mesopotamia solved the same problem differently. Both created cities, both developed writing, both built complex societies, but the details are completely different. Mesopotamia was hierarchical. Kings, priests, temples, palaces, power concentrated, visible, celebrated. The Indus Valley was something else. Organized but not obviously hierarchical, planned but not monumental, complex but quiet. Mesopotamia left texts, thousands of texts. We know their kings, their myths, their laws, their daily bureaucracy. The Indus Valley left silence. We see what they built, what they made, but we don't hear their voices. Think about what this means. Civilization isn't one thing. It's not one path. You can build cities without kings. You can organize thousands of people without temples. You can create writing we still can't read. You can maintain standards without monuments to power. The Indus Valley challenges assumptions. We think civilization requires certain things: rulers, armies, temples, inequality. But maybe it doesn't. Maybe there are other ways. Or maybe we're missing something. Maybe there were rulers. Maybe there was inequality. Maybe we just can't see it. The problem with silence is you can project anything onto it. The Indus Valley might have been egalitarian, or it might have had power structures we don't recognize. We're guessing. What we can say is this: they built something that lasted 2,000 years, cities that worked, trade that functioned, standards that held. People lived, worked, played, raised children, made art, all without leaving records we can read. They're a reminder. History is mostly silence. We know a tiny fraction. The civilizations that left texts, that built monuments, that wanted to be remembered. But most people didn't. Most cultures didn't. They just lived. And then they were gone. The Indus Valley left cities, streets, drains, seals, toys, jewelry, the physical traces of life. But the meaning, the stories, the names, the thoughts, gone. Stand in Mohenjo-Daro today. The ruins are still there. The grid streets, the brick houses, the Great Bath. You can walk the same paths people walked 4,500 years ago. The city is silent, empty. The wind moves through empty rooms. Sand covers the streets, but once it was full, voices, laughter, arguments, children playing, merchants haggling, craftsmen working, normal life, human life. We can see where they lived. We just can't hear them. Maybe someday someone will crack the script, decipher the writing, give them voices again. Or maybe not. Maybe the Indus Valley stays silent, a civilization we can see but never fully know. Either way, they were here. They built something remarkable. They lived lives as full and complex as ours. They solved problems, created beauty, raised families, all in their own way, a way that worked for 2,000 years. That's worth remembering. Even if we can't read their words, even if we don't know their names, they were here. They mattered. They built something that lasted longer than most empires. And then they let it go. The cities emptied. The people moved on. Life continued, just differently, smaller, quieter, but continuous. We're left with questions, beautiful questions. How did they organize without obvious rulers? What did their writing say? What did they believe? What stories did they tell their children? We'll probably never know. And that's okay. Some mysteries stay mysteries. The Indus Valley reminds us that civilization takes many forms, that there's no single path, that people can organize in ways we don't expect, that silence doesn't mean simplicity, that we know less than we think. Here's the thing about cities. They're not natural. Humans didn't evolve to live in cities. We evolved in small groups, 20 people, 50 people, maybe 100 at most. That's what our brains are wired for. For 290,000 years, that's how we lived. Small bands, moving around, following food, following seasons, and it worked. We spread across the planet. We survived ice ages. We thrived. Then suddenly, around 10,000 years ago, we started gathering in larger groups, villages, towns, cities, thousands of people living together, strangers living side by side. Why? This is one of the big questions. Why did cities form at all? What made people give up the mobile life? What made them stay in one place? What made them accept living with thousands of strangers? The standard answer is agriculture. Farming created surplus. Surplus allowed specialization. Specialization required coordination. Cities emerged, simple cause and effect. But it's not that simple. Agriculture came first, yes, around 10,000 BCE in the Fertile Crescent. People started planting crops, domesticating animals, settling down. But cities didn't appear immediately. There's a gap, a long gap. Jericho might have been urban by 9000 BCE. Maybe. It had 1,000 people, a tower, a wall, but it's an outlier. Most places stayed small. Villages, a few hundred people at most, for thousands of years. Real cities didn't emerge until around 4000 BCE. That's 5,000 years after agriculture started. 5,000 years. Why the delay? Think about what a city requires. It's not just a lot of people, it's organization, coordination, specialists who don't grow their own food, builders, craftsmen, priests, administrators, soldiers, all depending on farmers to feed them. That requires trust. The farmer has to trust he'll get paid. The craftsman has to trust he'll get fed. The administrator has to trust people will listen. Without trust, cities can't exist. It also requires surplus, enough extra food to feed non-farmers, enough extra labor to build walls, temples, houses, streets. You can't build a city if everyone's barely surviving, and it requires authority. Someone has to organize things, decide who builds what, who gets what, who does what. In a band of 20 people, you can decide things together. In a city of 10,000, you need structure, hierarchy, power. So maybe the question isn't why cities formed. Maybe it's what changed that allowed them to form. What made surplus possible? What made authority acceptable? What made trust extend beyond family? Let's look at Uruk again. Around 4000 BCE it started growing. By 3000 BCE it had 40,000 people. What happened? What changed? The environment helped. The land between the Tigris and Euphrates was fertile. Flooding deposited silt, rich soil, good for farming. Irrigation made it better. Canals brought water to fields. Yields increased. More food per acre, more food per farmer. That created surplus. One farmer could feed himself and others. That freed people to do other things. Make pots, work metal, build, administer. The specialists appeared because the surplus allowed them. But surplus alone doesn't create cities. Plenty of agricultural societies stayed small. Scattered villages. No urban centres. Something else was needed. Maybe it was religion. Uruk had the Eanna temple complex, massive buildings, dedicated to Inanna, the goddess of love and war. People came to worship, to give offerings, to participate in festivals. The temple became a centre, a gathering point. People came from surrounding villages. They brought grain, animals, goods. The temple stored them, redistributed them. The priests managed it, coordinated it. This created a hub, a place where people gathered, where goods flowed, where decisions got made. Around that hub a city grew. Specialists settled nearby, to serve the temple, to trade with visitors, to participate in the system. Religion provided authority. The priests spoke for the gods. Their decisions had divine backing. People accepted that, trusted it, organized around it. The temple became the organizing principle, or maybe it was trade. Mesopotamia had fertile land, good for farming, but it lacked other resources. No stone, no metal, no timber. Those had to come from elsewhere. Trade networks developed. Merchants brought copper from Oman, timber from Lebanon, stone from Anatolia, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan. These goods flowed into Mesopotamia, into the cities. Cities became trade hubs, markets. places where goods from different regions met, where merchants gathered, where craftsmen worked imported materials. The trade created wealth, the wealth attracted people, the people created cities. Both explanations probably have truth. Religion and trade, sacred and economic, they reinforced each other. The temple attracted people, the people attracted trade, the trade enriched the temple, the cycle fed itself. But there's another factor, defense. Living together provides protection. A village of 100 people can be raided, destroyed. A city of 10,000. That's harder. Walls help, soldiers help, numbers help. Early cities had walls. Uruk's walls were massive, 6 miles around, 30 feet high, wide enough for chariots on top. That took enormous labour, thousands of workers, years of effort. Why build them if defence wasn't important? Maybe cities formed partly from fear. Raids were common. Violence was constant. Banding together made sense. Safety in numbers. Protection in walls. Cities as fortresses. Here's what's interesting. Different regions developed cities independently. Mesopotamia around 4000 BCE. Egypt around 3100 BCE. The Indus Valley around 3300 BCE. China around 2000 BCE. Mesoamerica around 1200 BCE. All separate. All solving the same problem. Each region had its own reasons, its own path. But the result was similar. Concentration, specialization, hierarchy, complexity. The pattern repeated across the world. In Egypt, cities formed around royal power. The pharaoh unified the land, organized labor, built monuments. Cities grew as administrative centers, places to manage the kingdom, to collect taxes, to store grain, to house officials. The Nile helped. Annual flooding was predictable, reliable. Irrigation was simpler than in Mesopotamia. Yields were high. Surplus was abundant. That surplus supported the cities, the bureaucracy, the monuments. In the Indus Valley, we don't know the mechanism. No temples we can identify. No palaces. No obvious rulers. But cities formed anyway. Planned cities. Grid streets. Sophisticated drainage. Something organized it. We just don't know what. Maybe it was merchant councils, collective leadership, trade networks coordinating things, or maybe there were rulers we can't identify, power expressed differently, without monuments, without texts we can read. In China, cities emerged around 2000 BCE, the Shang dynasty, bronze working, oracle bones, royal tombs, cities as centers of power, military power, religious power, economic power, all concentrated. In Mesoamerica, the Olmec built centers around 1200 BCE. Not quite cities, more like ceremonial complexes, but they concentrated people, organized labor, created monuments. The pattern was starting. Each region had different resources, different challenges, different solutions, but the basic idea emerged everywhere. Bring people together. Organize them, specialize, build. Cities. Why? What's the common thread? What made this happen independently in multiple places? Maybe it's population pressure. As populations grew, people needed to organize differently. Small bands worked for low populations. Villages worked for medium populations. Cities worked for high populations. The form followed the function. Or maybe it's competition. Groups competed for resources, for land, for water, for trade routes. Larger groups won. Cities were larger groups. They could field bigger armies, control more territory, dominate trade. Success bred imitation. Or maybe it's complexity. As societies got more complex, they needed coordination. Irrigation systems required management. Trade networks required organization. Craft specialization required markets. Cities provided the infrastructure for complexity. Probably all of these, population, competition, complexity, religion, trade, defense, multiple factors pushing in the same direction, toward concentration, toward organization, toward cities. But here's what's strange. Cities aren't obviously better for individuals. Life in early cities was hard. Disease spread easily. Sanitation was poor. Violence was common. Inequality was extreme. Most people were worse off than their ancestors in villages. Studies of skeletons show this. Early farmers were shorter than hunter-gatherers, less healthy, more disease. Early city dwellers were even worse. Malnutrition, infections, injuries. Life was brutal. So why did people stay? Why did cities grow? If individual life was worse, why did the system persist? Maybe people didn't have a choice. Once cities formed, they dominated. They controlled resources, land, water, trade. If you wanted to survive, you had to participate. Join the city, accept its rules, work within its system. Or maybe the benefits weren't individual. They were collective. Cities could do things villages couldn't. Build monuments, wage war, conduct trade, create art, develop knowledge. Individuals suffered, but the group succeeded. That's a dark thought. That civilization required individual sacrifice. That progress meant some people living worse so the group could achieve more. But it might be true. Or maybe people saw benefits we don't measure. Community, identity, participation in something larger. The monuments weren't just rulers' vanity. They were collective achievements, proof of what the group could do. That might have mattered. Religion provided meaning. Your suffering had purpose. You were serving the gods, building their houses, participating in cosmic order. That makes suffering bearable, gives it context, makes it meaningful. The question of why cities formed leads to deeper questions. Why do humans organize? Why do we accept hierarchy? Why do we build things that outlast us? Why do we sacrifice for groups? These aren't just historical questions, they're about human nature, about what makes us different from other animals, about why we do what we do. Other primates live in groups. They have hierarchies, but they don't build. They don't create lasting structures. They don't organize thousands of individuals toward collective goals. We do. Why? Maybe it's language. Language allows coordination at scale. You can explain plans, coordinate actions, share knowledge. Without language, you can't build a city. With it, you can. Maybe it's culture. The ability to transmit knowledge across generations. Each generation builds on the last, accumulates, improves. Cities are accumulated knowledge, generations of building, learning, refining. Maybe it's imagination. The ability to conceive of things that don't exist yet, to plan, to envision, to work toward distant goals. You can't build a temple without imagining it first, without believing it can exist. Cities required all of these. Language to coordinate, culture to accumulate, imagination to plan. They're uniquely human achievements, possible only because of our unique capacities, but they're also fragile. Cities depend on systems, supply chains, trade networks, authority structures. When those systems break, cities collapse. Fast. We've seen this repeatedly. The Bronze Age collapse, the fall of Rome, the Maya collapse, the end of the Indus Valley, cities that seemed permanent, eternal, gone in generations. That fragility is important. Cities aren't natural. They're not inevitable. They're human constructions, maintained by constant effort, constant coordination, constant trust. When any of those fail, the whole thing can unravel. So why did cities form? Because conditions allowed them. Because people chose them. Because they solved problems. Because they offered possibilities. Because they worked. For a while, they concentrated power, created inequality, enabled specialization, allowed complexity, made civilization possible, for better and worse. We're still living with the consequences, still living in cities, still organized in hierarchies, still accepting systems that benefit the group more than the individual, still building, still imagining, still trying to make it work. The first cities were experiments, tests of what humans could do, what we could build, how we could organize. Some succeeded, some failed. All taught us something about ourselves. We learned we could live with strangers, could trust systems, could work toward distant goals, could create beauty, could accumulate knowledge, could build things that lasted. We also learned we could accept inequality, could tolerate suffering, could sacrifice individuals for collective goals, could organize violence, could destroy as well as create. Cities made us who we are, shaped our societies, our cultures, our minds. We're urban creatures now, most of us, living in the systems those first cities pioneered, still figuring out how to make them work, still paying the costs, still reaping the benefits. The question of why cities formed is really a question of why we are the way we are, why we organize, why we build, why we accept complexity, why we keep trying to make systems work despite their costs. We don't have final answers, just theories, evidence, patterns. The truth is probably messy, multiple causes, different in each place, contingent on circumstances, human, complicated. But the cities rose. That's the fact. From Uruk to Mohenjo-Daro to Memphis to Anyang, humans gathered, organized, built, created civilization, for all its flaws, for all its costs. We did it. We're still doing it. And maybe that's enough of an answer. We build cities because we can, because we're the kind of creature that builds, that organizes, that imagines and creates. It's what we do, what we've always done, what we'll probably keep doing. The first cities were just the beginning, so you've got thousands of people living together, maybe tens of thousands, all in one place. How does that actually work? This is the practical question, the nuts and bolts. Because cities aren't just big villages, they're different. They require systems, organization, rules. Without those, they fall apart. Think about food. In a village, everyone grows their own, or almost everyone. You plant, you harvest, you eat. Simple, direct. If you don't work, you don't eat. Clear cause and effect. In a city, most people don't grow food. They're craftsmen, builders, priests, merchants, soldiers, administrators. They depend on farmers to feed them. Farmers who live outside the city, in surrounding villages, in the countryside. How do you get food from those farmers to the city dwellers? How do you make sure it happens? How do you organize it? You need a system, a mechanism, something that moves food from fields to mouths, reliably, consistently, every day. The earlier cities used redistribution. The temple or palace collected food. Farmers brought grain, animals, oil, wine. They delivered it to central storage. The temple recorded it, stored it, then redistributed it. Workers got rations. So many liters of grain per month. So much oil. So much beer. The amounts were fixed, written down. Everyone knew what they'd get. The system was predictable. We have records of this. Clay tablets from Uruk, from Ur, list of rations, who got what, when, how much, thousands of tablets, all tracking the flow of goods. One tablet. Lists barley rations for workers, Another lists wool distributions, another tracks dates and figs. The detail is incredible. Every transaction recorded, every amount noted. This required writing, numbers, record keeping. You can't run a redistribution system without tracking things, without knowing who gave what, who gets what, without memory external to human minds. Writing emerged in Mesopotamia around 3200 BCE, not for literature, not for stories, for accounting, for tracking grain, counting sheep, recording debts. The first writing was economic. The symbols were simple: a circle for grain, a triangle for sheep, numbers, quantities, who, what, how much. That's all they needed at first. Later it got more complex. The symbols combined, became words, sentences. But the origin was practical, administrative. Cities needed to track things. Writing let them do it. The redistribution system created power. Whoever controlled the storage controlled the food. Whoever controlled the food controlled the people. The temple priest had that power, or the palace administrators, depending on the city. They decided who got what, how much, when. They could reward loyalty, punish disobedience. The food supply was leverage, control, authority made tangible. But redistribution wasn't the only system. Trade developed too. Markets, places where people exchange goods directly. Farmer brings grain, trades it for pots. Potter trades pots for metal. Smith trades metal for cloth. Weaver trades cloth for grain. The cycle continues. Markets were less controlled, more flexible. People made their own deals, set their own prices. The temple didn't manage everything, just collected taxes, a portion of each transaction, enough to fund itself, to pay its workers, to maintain its authority. Different cities used different mixes. Some relied heavily on redistribution, central control. Others allowed more market activity, private exchange. Both systems worked, both had advantages. Redistribution was predictable, stable. Everyone knew what they'd get. No surprises, no shortages. As long as the harvest was good, as long as the system functioned, markets were flexible, responsive. Prices adjusted to supply and demand. If grain was scarce, prices rose. If it was abundant, they fell. The system balanced itself, automatically. But markets required trust. You had to believe the potter would actually give you pots for your grain, that the metal you got was real, that people wouldn't cheat. Without trust, markets don't work. Cities developed mechanisms for trust, standards, a standard measure for grain, a standard weight for metal. Everyone used the same units. That made exchange fair, predictable. We've found standard weights from ancient cities, stone weights, carefully shaped, marked with symbols. These weren't random, they were official, verified. Using the wrong weight was probably punishable. There were also laws, rules for trade, for contracts, for debts. The Code of Hammurabi from Babylon lists prices, interest rates, penalties for fraud. The law backed up the market, made cheating costly. Courts resolved disputes. If someone claimed they were cheated, they could appeal, present their case, get a judgment. The system had mechanisms for justice, for enforcement. This required specialists, judges, scribes, lawyers, people who knew the laws, could read the contracts, could make decisions, more non-farmers, more people depending on the food system. Water was another challenge. Cities need water, lots of it. Drinking, cooking, washing, irrigation for nearby fields. Where does it come from? Some cities were on rivers, the Nile, the Tigris, the Euphrates, the Indus. Water was available, but it needed to be distributed, brought into the city, delivered to neighborhoods, to houses. Mesopotamian cities built canals, channels that brought water from rivers into the city, through the streets. Some houses had private wells, others used public fountains, cisterns, shared water sources. Managing water required coordination. Someone had to maintain the canals, clean them, repair them, decide who got water when, especially during dry seasons when water was scarce. This was probably controlled centrally. The temple or palace. They organized the labor, set the rules, enforced them. Water was too important to leave unmanaged. The Indus Valley cities had something remarkable. Sophisticated drainage. Almost every house connected to a drainage system. Covered drains in the streets. Wastewater flowed away, out of the city. This required planning, engineering. The whole city laid out with drainage in mind. Streets on a grid, houses aligned, drains sloping correctly. It's impressive. More sophisticated than most cities for the next 3,000 years. Who planned it? Who built it? We don't know. But someone organized it, coordinated it, made it happen. That level of infrastructure doesn't appear by accident. Sanitation was a constant problem. Thousands of people, all producing waste. Where does it go? If it stays in the city, disease spreads. Fast. Deadly. Some cities had public latrines, shared toilets, waste collected in pits, periodically emptied, taken outside the city, used as fertilizer maybe, or just dumped. Other cities were less organized. Waste in the streets, in alleys, piling up. This created health problems, disease, epidemics. Early cities were disease incubators. Crowded, dirty, dangerous. Studies of ancient skeletons show high rates of infection, parasites, malnutrition. Life expectancy was low, especially for the poor, the workers, the people at the bottom. Elite burials show better health, better nutrition, access to more food, better living conditions. Inequality wasn't just economic, it was physical, biological. You could see it in the bones. Security was another system. Cities needed protection from raiders, from rival cities, from internal disorder. How do you keep thousands of people safe? Walls helped. Most early cities had them. Massive walls. Thick, high. Gates that closed at night. Guards watching. The walls were a statement. We're protected. We're strong. Don't attack us. But walls need defenders, soldiers, men trained to fight, equipped with weapons, organized into units. Early cities had standing armies, or at least militias, citizens who could be called up. Uruk's walls were huge, 6 miles around. That's a lot of wall to defend. You'd need thousands of soldiers, all fed, all equipped, all coordinated. That's a major expense, a major commitment. Inside the city, you needed police. People to maintain order, stop theft, settle disputes, break up fights. Cities had officials for this, probably armed, probably feared. Crime was a problem. Lots of people, lots of strangers, lots of opportunities. Theft, assault, murder. Cities needed laws, enforcement, punishment. Punishments were harsh. The Code of Hammurabi lists them. Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. Theft punished by cutting off hands. Murder by execution. The penalties were severe, public, meant to deter. There were also social controls. Reputation mattered. In a village, everyone knows everyone. Your reputation follows you. In a city, that's harder. But neighborhoods developed. Communities within the city. People who knew each other, watched each other. Guilds formed. Groups of craftsmen, potters, smiths, weavers. They set standards, trained apprentices, regulated their trade. Membership meant something, gave you identity, status, protection. Religion played a role too. Temples weren't just for worship. They were social centres, community hubs. People gathered there, participated in festivals, shared meals. The temple created bonds, connections beyond family. Festivals were important, regular events. Everyone participated. Processions through the streets, sacrifices, feasts. These created shared experience, collective identity. You weren't just an individual. You were part of something larger. The New Year festival in Babylon lasted 12 days. Processions, rituals. The king renewed his authority. The gods renewed the world. Everyone participated. Rich and poor, citizens and slaves. It bound the city together. Housing varied by status. The elite lived in large houses, multiple rooms, courtyards, storage areas, servants' quarters, built of brick, sometimes stone, decorated, comfortable. Workers lived in smaller houses, 1 or 2 rooms, shared walls, minimal space, built of mud brick, simple, functional, crowded. The poor lived in even worse conditions, shacks, lean-tos, whatever they could build, or they rented space, a corner of a room, a spot on a roof, anything. Neighbourhoods segregated by status, rich areas, poor areas, craft districts where specific trades clustered, potters in one area, smiths in another, weavers elsewhere. This made sense. Shared resources, shared knowledge, shared customers. Streets were narrow, winding, not planned in most cities. They grew organically. Houses built wherever there was space. Streets formed between them, alleys, dead ends, mazes. The Indus cities were different. Grid layout, streets at right angles, planned, organised. But they're the exception. Most ancient cities were chaotic, organic, messy. Garbage was everywhere, in the streets, in alleys, against walls. Cities stank, rotting food, human waste, animal waste, smoke from fires. The smell must have been overwhelming. Fires were a constant danger. Houses built close together, wooden beams, thatched roofs. One fire could spread, destroy whole neighbourhoods. Cities burned regularly, then rebuilt. Markets were the economic heart. Open spaces, stalls, merchants selling goods, farmers bringing produce, craftsmen displaying wares, people bargaining, arguing, trading. The market was loud, crowded, chaotic, alive. Markets happened on specific days, weekly maybe. People came from surrounding villages, brought what they had, bought what they needed. The market connected city and countryside, created exchange, flow of goods. Temples and palaces were the architectural centres, massive buildings, visible from far away, built on platforms, raised above the city, dominating the skyline. These were statements of power, wealth, authority. The ziggurats of Mesopotamia were temple platforms, stepped pyramids, reaching toward the sky, the temple at the top, accessible by stairs. Only priests could enter. The gods lived there, supposedly. Building these required enormous labour, thousands of workers, years of effort, millions of bricks, all made by hand, carried by hand, placed by hand. The scale is staggering. Why build them? Partly religious, to honour the gods, to provide them homes, to maintain cosmic order. Partly political, to demonstrate power, to awe the population, to show what the city could achieve. Palaces were similar, large, impressive. The king lived there, conducted business there, received visitors, held court. The palace was the administrative centre, where decisions got made, where power resided. Inside were throne rooms, storage rooms, living quarters, kitchens, workshops. A palace was like a city within a city, self-contained, self-sufficient. Hundreds of people lived and worked there. The palace had its own economy, its own workshops, its own storage. It produced goods, traded them, collected taxes, distributed rations. It was a major economic actor, sometimes the dominant one. Craft production was organized. Some craftsmen worked independently, made goods, sold them in the market, kept the profits. Others worked for the temple or palace, received rations, produced goods for redistribution or trade. We have records of palace workshops, lists of workers, what they made, how much. Textile workshops with dozens of weavers, all women, producing cloth for the palace, for trade, for tribute. Metal workshops produced weapons, tools, luxury goods. Smiths were valued. Their skills rare, important. They got better rations, higher status, special treatment. Pottery was everywhere. Every household needed pots, for storage, for cooking, for serving. Potters were common, their products essential, mass-produced, standardized, efficient. The wheel was crucial, potter's wheel, spinning clay, shaping it quickly, uniformly. This increased production, made pots cheaper, more available. The wheel spread fast. Everyone adopted it. Trade brought in what cities couldn't produce: metals, stone, timber, luxury goods. Merchants travelled far, hundreds of miles, thousands sometimes, following trade routes, carrying goods. Ships moved goods by water, rivers, coasts, seas, faster than land, cheaper, more efficient. Port cities thrived, became trade hubs, connecting regions, cultures, economies. Caravans moved goods by land, donkeys, camels, oxen, carrying packs, pulling carts, slow, expensive, but necessary. Some goods could only come by land, some routes had no water. Merchants were a class, distinct. Neither farmers nor craftsmen, they moved goods, made connections, took risks. Some got rich, very rich. Others failed, lost everything. It was uncertain, dangerous, potentially lucrative. Cities taxed trade, goods entering, goods leaving, a percentage, a fee. This funded the city, paid for walls, temples, administrators, soldiers. Trade created wealth. Cities captured some of it. The whole system was interconnected. Food production supported specialists. Specialists produced goods. Goods were traded. Trade brought wealth. Wealth funded construction. Construction employed workers. Workers needed food. The cycle continued. When any part failed, the system stressed. Bad harvest meant less food. Less food meant fewer rations. Fewer rations meant hungry workers. Hungry workers meant less production. Less production meant less trade. Less trade meant less wealth. The cycle reversed. Cities were fragile, dependent on systems, on coordination, on trust, on continued function. When systems broke, cities could collapse, fast, completely. But when systems worked, cities thrived, grew, built, created, accumulated wealth, knowledge, power. They became centers of culture, of innovation, of human achievement. The daily operation of cities was complex, challenging, impressive. Thousands of people, all depending on systems, on organization, on each other, all making it work. Somehow. That's the practical magic of cities. Not religious, not mystical, just human organization, coordination, cooperation, at scale, making the impossible routine, making complexity functional. Cities didn't exist in isolation. They were connected to each other, to distant places, through trade networks that stretched for hundreds of miles, sometimes thousands. Think about what a city needs. Food comes from nearby, from the countryside, from farmers within a day's walk. Maybe two? That's local, manageable. But other things, metal, stone, timber, luxury, goods, these come from far away, from places the city can't control, can't access directly. They have to be brought in, traded for, transported across long distances. This creates networks, routes, connections between distant places, between people who never meet, between cultures that barely know each other exists. The earliest trade networks are old, really old. Obsidian trade in Anatolia goes back 12,000 years. Before cities, before agriculture, hunter-gatherers trading volcanic glass, moving it hundreds of miles, passing it from group to group. Why obsidian? It's sharp, sharper than anything else available, makes incredible blades, cutting tools, weapons. If you had access to obsidian, you had an advantage. People wanted it, would trade for it. Archaeologists can trace obsidian. Each volcanic source has a unique chemical signature. By testing artifacts, they can tell where the obsidian came from. Map the trade routes. See how far it travelled. Some obsidian from central Turkey shows up 500 miles away, in Syria, in the Levant, moving through multiple hands, multiple transactions, each person taking a bit of profit, each group passing it along. That's how trade networks work. Not one merchant travelling 500 miles, multiple short hops, village to village, group to group. The goods travel far, the people don't. By the time cities emerged, these networks were already established, already functioning. Cities plugged into them, became nodes, major hubs where routes converged, where goods accumulated, where trade intensified. Mesopotamian cities needed metal, copper, tin, silver, gold. None of this was local. The river valleys had mud, clay, reeds, water, no metal, no stone, no timber worth mentioning. Copper came from Anatolia, from the Zagros Mountains, from Oman, hundreds of miles away. Tin came from even farther, Afghanistan maybe, Central Asia. Nobody's completely sure. The sources were distant, remote, hard to reach. But cities needed bronze, copper plus tin, bronze tools, bronze weapons. Bronze was essential, worth the effort, worth the cost, worth organizing expeditions to get it. Merchants traveled these routes, professional traders, people who made their living moving goods. They knew the routes, the dangers, the contacts, who to trade with, who to avoid, what was valuable where. We have records of merchant activity, clay tablets from Mesopotamia, letters between merchants, business agreements, lists of goods, debts, payments. The detail is remarkable. One tablet is a letter from a merchant to his partner, complaining. The copper shipment was late. The quality was poor. Some ingots were missing. He's angry, wants answers, wants compensation. Another tablet lists a caravan's contents. So many textiles, so much grain, specific amounts of oil, wine, the value calculated, the expected profit noted. This was serious business, big money, high stakes. Trade caravans were expensive, dangerous. You needed animals, donkeys, camels, oxen. You needed drivers, guards, supplies for the journey, food, water, equipment. You faced bandits, raiding parties, hostile territories, desert crossings, mountain passes, rivers to ford, weather, storms, heat, cold. Every journey was risky. Many didn't return, but the profits could be enormous. A successful trading expedition could make you rich, very rich. Merchants who survived, who made good deals, who built relationships, they accumulated wealth, became powerful, influential. Some merchants were independent, self-employed, risking their own capital. Others worked for temples or palaces as agents, conducting trade on behalf of the institution, getting paid a salary, taking less risk, making less profit. Sea trade was different, faster, more efficient. You could move more goods, heavier goods, bulk commodities, things too heavy for land caravans. Ships sailed the Persian Gulf, the Red Sea, the Mediterranean, the Indian Ocean, following coasts mostly, staying in sight of land, but sometimes crossing open water, taking chances, seeking profit. The Indus Valley cities traded by sea. We know because their artifacts show up in Mesopotamia: seals, beads, specific types of pottery, and Mesopotamian goods show up in the Indus Valley. The connection was real, active, regular. Ships from Dilmun, modern Bahrain, served as intermediaries. They sailed to the Indus, loaded goods, sailed back to Mesopotamia, unloaded, made profit on both ends. Dilmun became wealthy, a trading hub, a crucial link. One Mesopotamian text mentions ships from Dilmun, dozens of them, docked at Ea, unloading cargo, copper, precious stones, exotic woods, goods from far away, from places Mesopotamians had never seen, would never see. This created economic interdependence. Cities relied on trade, on imports, on connections to distant places. If trade stopped, cities suffered shortages, price increases, social stress. But trade also spread ideas, technologies, artistic styles, religious concepts. Traders brought back stories, descriptions, knowledge. They'd seen other cities, other ways of doing things, other innovations. The potter's wheel spread this way, invented somewhere, probably Mesopotamia, then adopted everywhere: Egypt, the Indus, Anatolia, Europe. The idea travelled, with traders, with migrants, with cultural contact. Writing spread similarly. The concept, not the specific script. Mesopotamia developed cuneiform. Egypt developed hieroglyphs. The Indus developed their own script. China developed characters, each unique. But the idea, the principle, that you could represent language visually, that spread. Weights and measures standardized through trade. If you're trading with someone, you need common standards, agreed measures. Otherwise, how do you know you're getting a fair deal? How do you compare prices? Standard weights appear across wide areas, similar shapes, similar materials, marked with similar symbols. These weren't accidents, they were deliberate, coordinated, agreed upon. Trade required it. The same with measures of volume, for grain, for oil, for wine. Standard containers, standard amounts, everyone using the same system, or at least compatible systems. Conversion rates, exchange rates, ways to translate between systems. This required communication, negotiation, agreement between cities, between regions, between cultures. Trade created diplomatic relationships, treaties, alliances, mutual interests. Cities that controlled trade routes became powerful, wealthy, influential. They could tax trade, take a cut, provide services, protection, storage, markets. Traders paid for these, willingly, because it made trade easier, safer, more profitable. Some cities were built specifically for trade, located at strategic points: river crossings, mountain passes, coastal harbours, places where routes converged, where goods naturally flowed. These cities didn't produce much themselves. They facilitated exchange, provided infrastructure, markets, warehouses, lodging. They lived off trade, off the fees, the taxes, the services they provided. Other cities combined production and trade, made goods, exported them, imported raw materials, processed them, exported finished products. They were manufacturing centres, adding value, creating wealth through transformation. Textiles were major trade goods: cloth, clothing, tapestries, light, valuable, easy to transport, high profit margins. Every city produced textiles, but some specialized, made finer cloth, better dyes, more intricate patterns. Mesopotamian cities exported textiles, high-quality wool cloth, dyed, decorated, sought after. They imported raw materials, dyes from distant places, special wools, then processed them, exported finished goods, made profit on the transformation. Luxury goods travelled farthest. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, carnelian from India, gold from Egypt, amber from the Baltic. These weren't necessities, they were status, symbols, prestige items, worth the effort, worth the cost. Elite burials contain these goods, jewellery, ornaments, decorations, materials from thousands of miles away. This showed wealth, connections, access to trade networks. It was conspicuous consumption, deliberate display. The royal cemetery at Ur contains incredible wealth. Gold, silver, lapis lazuli, carnelian, shell. Materials from everywhere, from all over the known world. Ur was connected, plugged in, part of a vast network. One burial contains a lyre, decorated with gold, with lapis, with shell inlay. The craftsmanship is extraordinary, but so is the material, gathered from 3 continents, brought together, combined, transformed into art. This required organization, coordination, long-term relationships. You can't get materials from Afghanistan on a whim. You need established roots, reliable partners, years of connections, generations maybe. Trade created cultural exchange. Mesopotamian cylinder seals show up in the Indus Valley. Indus weights show up in Mesopotamia. Egyptian artifacts show up in both places. Ideas flowing, mixing, influencing each other. Artistic styles blended, motifs borrowed, techniques shared. A decoration from one culture appears in another, modified, adapted, made local, but the origin is visible, the connection clear. Religious ideas probably travelled too. Gods, myths, rituals, harder to trace, less material evidence, but likely. People talk, tell stories, share beliefs. Traders weren't just moving goods, they were moving culture. Languages influenced each other. Loanwords, borrowed terms, words for trade goods, for technologies, for concepts that didn't exist before. Language adapts, incorporates, reflects contact. But trade also created conflict, competition. Cities wanted control of routes, of resources, of profitable connections. They fought over them, went to war, conquered territories to secure trade. Some wars were explicitly about trade, about access, about denying rivals, about monopolizing profitable routes. Economics drove politics, drove military action, drove empire building. Controlling trade meant controlling wealth. Wealth meant power. Power meant security, influence, the ability to build, to hire soldiers, to expand, to dominate. Trade was strategic, essential, worth fighting for. Trade routes were vulnerable, long, exposed, dependent on stability, on safe passage. When regions destabilized, trade suffered, routes closed, goods stopped flowing. Cities felt the impact. Drought could disrupt trade. If pastures dried up, animals died. Caravans couldn't travel. Desert routes became impassable. Trade stopped. Cities that depended on it struggled. Political collapse disrupted trade. If a key intermediary city fell, routes broke, connections severed. Alternative routes existed sometimes, but not always, not immediately. Disruption took time to overcome. Pirates disrupted sea trade. Raiders on land routes, bandits, hostile tribes. They preyed on caravans, on ships, made trade dangerous, expensive, sometimes impossible. Cities had to fight them, protect routes, maintain security. Some cities built outposts, fortified stations along trade routes, garrisoned, defended. These protected caravans provided rest stops, storage, security. They were investments in trade, in maintaining connections. The economics of trade were complex. Prices varied by distance, by risk, by demand, by supply. A commodity cheap at the source became expensive far away. The markup covered costs, risks, profit. Merchants calculated carefully, knew the math, understood margins, what they could sell for, what they had to pay, what it cost to transport, what profit remained. This was sophisticated business, required skill, knowledge, experience. Credit existed, loans, advances. A merchant borrowed capital, bought goods, travelled, sold them, returned, paid back the loan with interest. This let merchants without capital participate, take risks, build wealth. But debt was dangerous. If the expedition failed, you still owed, with interest. You could lose everything, end up in debt slavery, indentured, working off what you owed. Trade created opportunity, also created risk. Partnerships spread risk. Two merchants pooling resources, sharing costs, sharing profits, sharing losses. If one expedition failed, the other might succeed. Diversification, risk management, smart business. We have contracts, written agreements between partners, specifying terms, who contributes what, how profits divide, what happens if things go wrong. These were legally binding, enforceable, protected interests. Trade created a merchant class, distinct, neither farmers nor craftsmen, not priests or soldiers. Something different. Business people, capitalists before capitalism, motivated by profit, by accumulation, by growth. This class gained influence. Wealth bought power, access, the ability to shape policy, to influence rulers, to advocate for their interests. Merchants wanted stability, open routes, fair taxation. They pushed for these. Some merchants became extremely wealthy, richer than some nobles, than some priests. Wealth created social mobility, a way up, a path from nothing to something, through skill, through risk, through success. But most merchants weren't wealthy. Most struggled, scraped by, took risks that didn't pay off, lost everything, ended up poor, indebted, broken. Success was possible, not guaranteed, not even likely. Trade networks were the arteries of early civilization, moving goods, moving ideas, moving people, connecting distant places, creating interdependence, making cities possible, making them thrive. Without trade, cities would be limited, constrained by local resources, unable to grow beyond certain sizes, unable to specialize, unable to accumulate wealth. Trade was essential, foundational, transformative. The networks were vast, complex, sophisticated, operating without modern technology, without fast communication, without centralized control, yet functioning reliably for centuries, for millennia. This was human organization at scale, coordination across distances, across cultures, across languages, driven by mutual benefit, by profit, by need, by desire. It worked because everyone gained, everyone had incentive to maintain it. When these networks broke, when trade stopped, cities felt it immediately. Shortages, economic collapse, social disruption, the Bronze Age collapse, the fall of Rome. Both involved trade network failures, both devastated cities, both ended eras. Trade made cities vulnerable, dependent, connected to forces beyond their control, to distant events, to other people's stability, to roots they couldn't fully protect. This was the price of prosperity, of growth, of civilization itself. Let's zoom in now. Imagine a city at the height of its power, in ancient Mesopotamia. Not just a city, but a place that shaped the world. Its influence reached far beyond its walls. For a while, was the most important city on Earth. At least that's how it looks from the evidence we have. Was built on the banks of the Euphrates River in what's now southern Iraq. If you saw it back then, you'd see a city unlike anything else. Huge mud brick walls surrounded it. Inside, buildings crowded together, narrow streets twisting between them. At the center stood the ziggurat, a massive stepped pyramid, rising above everything. You couldn't miss it. It dominated the skyline, even from miles away. The ziggurat wasn't just for show, it was the city's heart. A temple dedicated to the moon god Nana. Priests climbed its stairs every day. Offerings were made, rituals performed. People believed the gods lived at the top. That's where heaven and earth met. But wasn't just about religion. It was a city of power, wealth, and people. At its peak, it may have held 65,000 people. That's huge for the time. Most. People on Earth still lived in villages with a few hundred people. Was something different. A magnet for trade, ideas, and ambition. Walking through you'd see merchants selling goods from far away. Copper from Oman, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, silver from Anatolia, textiles, grain, oil, beer. The markets were busy, loud. Money changed hands quickly. Prices haggled over. Deals struck. Everyone wanted a piece of the action. There were neighborhoods for different crafts. Potters, metalworkers, weavers, bakers. Each had their own streets, their own workshops. The city ran on specialization. People didn't just farm or hunt. They made things, fixed things, traded things. Jobs passed from parent to child. Skills kept alive for generations. The homes in were mostly 2 stories, made of mud brick, flat roofs, small windows. Inside, rooms were arranged around a central courtyard. People cooked, ate, and talked together. Nights could be hot, so families might sleep on the roof under the stars. Life was crowded but close-knit. Water was a constant concern. Sat near the river, but the climate was hot and dry. Canals ran through the city, bringing water for drinking, cooking, and irrigation. Maintaining these canals took effort. If a canal silted up, crops failed. People went hungry. So canal maintenance was everyone's problem. There were laws about it. If you didn't help, you could be fined, or worse. Government was complex. At the top was the king. He was more than a ruler. He was seen as chosen by the gods. Below him were officials, priests, and scribes. Record-keeping was a big deal. Every transaction, every law, every harvest, written down on clay tablets. The city was full of scribes. They learned to write cuneiform, one of the world's first writing systems. Sharp reeds pressed into wet clay. Marks and symbols that told stories, recorded deals, kept track of debts. Those tablets are a goldmine for historians. They reveal details of daily life, contracts, receipts, lists of workers, taxes collected. We see a city that was organized, planned, and always busy. Ur's wealth is clear from what's been found in its graves. The royal cemetery is famous. Archaeologists found gold crowns, jewel daggers, elaborate musical instruments. Everything points to a society with huge differences between rich and poor. The elite lived in luxury. Most people didn't. But even regular citizens had access to things that would amaze villagers from just a few miles away. Beer, bread, fish, meat, and imported goods. Religion shaped everything. The temples were not just for worship. They were banks, storage places, and centers of power. People brought offerings, grain, animals, goods. The temples owned land, slaves, and animals. They loaned money, controlled trade, hired workers. The line between religious and economic life was blurry. Festivals filled the year. The biggest was the New Year's festival. It lasted for days. Parades, feasts, sacrifices, music. The whole city took part. People wore their best clothes, ate special food. There was drinking, singing, even games. For a few days, normal life stopped. Everyone celebrated together. But life in wasn't easy. Disease was common. Water could carry illness. So could rats, flies, and other pests. Medicine existed, but it was basic. Most people relied on prayers, spells, and herbal remedies. If you got seriously sick, you hoped for the best. Crime was a problem too. Laws were harsh. The Code of Ur-Nammu, one of the world's oldest law codes, comes from here. It listed crimes and punishments. Some were fines. Some were much worse. Justice was swift. The goal was to maintain order, not mercy. Slavery was part of life. Some people were born slaves. Others became slaves because of debt, war, or crime. Slaves worked the fields, cleaned houses, hauled goods. Some could buy their freedom, but most never did. Women had some rights. They could own property, run businesses, and sign contracts. But most power stayed with men. Marriage was arranged, divorce was allowed but rare. Families mattered. Your relatives were your safety net. Was always changing. The river shifted course again and again. Sometimes the city flooded. Other times drought threatened crops. People adapted, built new canals, rebuilt walls, repaired homes. The city endured. Trade made rich, but it also made it vulnerable. If trade routes failed, the city suffered. If crops failed, people starved. When enemies attacked, the city had to defend itself. War was common. Armies marched. Cities fought over land, water, and power. Ur had rivals. Lagash, Umma, Kish, and others. Each wanted to be the biggest, the richest, the most powerful. Wars broke out. Cities conquered each other, sometimes more than once. Kings boasted of their victories on stone monuments. But the balance of power kept shifting. Ur's kings tried to hold things together. They built massive walls, temples, and canals. They issued laws, collected taxes, and led armies. But even the strongest kings couldn't control everything. Sometimes the river shifted, sometimes the weather changed, sometimes enemies got lucky. Reached its peak under King Ur-Nammu, around 2100 BCE. He built the famous ziggurat. He issued the world's first known law code. He tried to make the center of everything. For a while, he succeeded. The city was stable, rich, and powerful. But nothing lasts forever. After Ur-Nammu, his son Shulgi ruled. He was a strong king, reformed the army, improved roads, standardized weights and measures, made sure taxes were collected. He wanted to keep at the top. Shulgi called himself King of Sumer and Akkad. He built new temples, started new festivals, and wrote hymns praising himself. He even claimed to be able to run from one city to another in a single day. Whether true or not, it shows how important image was. Kings needed to seem larger than life. After Shulgi, things started to fall apart. His successors weren't as strong. Rivals grew bolder. The climate may have turned drier. Rivers changed course. Trade routes shifted. Enemies from the east, the Elamites, started to attack. The system that made rich started to break down. But let's pause for a moment. Think about what achieved in just a few centuries. This was a city where people invented new ways of living. They organized labor on a huge scale, built monumental architecture, created systems for writing, law, and government, developed advances in math, astronomy, and literature. Yer's scribes wrote some of humanity's first stories. The Epic of Gilgamesh comes from this world. So do the earliest records of taxes, property exchanges, and contracts. The idea of a written law code starts here. The idea that kings are chosen by the gods, that's here too. The city was a magnet for talent. Artists, craftsmen, priests and traders flocked to Ur. Each group brought something new, ideas mixed, styles blended. The city's art, music and literature became famous. Other cities copied them. Ur's economy was complex, taxes funded public works, temples managed huge estates, farmers grew wheat, barley, dates, fishermen worked the rivers and canals, shepherds raised sheep in the fields beyond the city. Every part of life was connected to the city's survival. The legal system was advanced for its time. Laws covered property, marriage, theft, assault. Judges heard cases. Evidence was presented. Punishments were carried out. The idea that there should be rules for everyone, that was new. It shaped later civilizations for thousands of years. Religion explained the world. Floods, droughts, disease, all seen as the will of the gods. Priests interpreted signs, led rituals, made sacrifices. The temples were full of activity, singing, music, feasting, processions. Religion held the city together, gave people hope, explained the unexplainable. Education existed too. Boys from wealthy families learned to write. They practiced by copying lists, proverbs and stories. Scribes were respected. Their skills opened doors to government, trade and temple work. Ur's influence stretched far. Ideas that started there spread to other cities. Writing, law, math and art. All copied, adapted, transformed. Even after Ur fell, its legacy lived on. But daily life could be hard. Streets were crowded. The smell of animals, food and people filled the air. Dust was everywhere. The river could flood without warning. Disease spread quickly. Yet the city somehow worked. People adapted, found ways to keep going. Let's talk about food for a moment. The diet was mostly bread, beer and dates. Fish from the river. Occasionally meat, sheep, goat or cattle. Vegetables when available. Beer was safer than water. Everyone drank it, even kids. It was thick, almost like soup. People used straws to avoid the floating bits. Clothing was simple. Wool robes tied at the waist, sandals for the hot ground, jewellery for those who could afford it, rings, bracelets, earrings. The richer you were, the flashier your clothes and ornaments. Music was everywhere. Lyres, drums, flutes, songs for work, for worship, for fun. Some of the oldest musical instruments come from Ur. The royal lyre, covered in gold and lapis lazuli, still amazes people today. But the city also saw poverty. Not everyone shared in the wealth. Some lived in cramped homes, worked long hours and barely got by. Beggars were common. Orphans had little help. The city was a place of sharp contrasts. Despite the challenges, Ur was alive. It buzzed with energy. People worked, traded, worshipped, argued, and dreamed. The city was more than buildings and walls. It was a living thing, shaped by its people, by their choices, by their hopes and fears. If you could visit Ur at its height, you'd be amazed by the size, the noise, the smells, the colours. You'd see a place both ancient and strangely familiar. People worried about the same things we do: work, family, money, love, safety. And that's what makes Ur so interesting. It's not just a pile of ruins, it's a window into the first time people tried living together at this scale. The first time they built a world bigger than any one person could understand. For a while, it worked. The city thrived. People believed it would last forever. But cities depend on many things: water, food, trade, peace, good government. If any one of these fails, the city suffers. If several fail at once, disaster follows. Ur's story is about what people can build when they work together. It's also about how fragile those achievements can be. A change in the river, a new enemy, a bad harvest. These could turn success to struggle, boom to bust. Still, the memory of Ur survived long after its walls crumbled. Later cities looked back to Ur as a model. Later kings claimed to be its heirs. Even today, the idea of the city, the hope, the chaos, the energy still echoes. We're living with it. In some ways, we never left Ur behind. But as Ur grew, so did its problems. The very things that made it powerful, trade, wealth, innovation, also made it fragile. When the balance tipped, things could go wrong fast. And that's the puzzle we're left with. How could such a powerful city fall? What signs pointed trouble? And was Ur's fate unique? Or did all early cities face the same dangers? The answers aren't simple, but the clues are there if you look closely. Let's look for the warning signs. When you study the world's first cities, you start to notice patterns. Things don't just fall apart overnight. There are hints. Sometimes they're small at first, hard to spot unless you know where to look, but over time they add up. The signs of decline are like cracks in a wall. You might not notice the first one, but eventually the whole thing comes down, so what should we look for? What clues did these ancient cities leave behind that tell us trouble was coming? There's a handful of big ones that historians and archaeologists keep coming back to. Let's walk through them, one by one, and see what the evidence actually shows. First up, shrinking populations. You might think cities always grow, but that's not true. Sometimes census records, graves, and abandoned houses tell a different story. Let's use Ur as an example again, but this time zoom out to other cities too. Archaeologists dig down through layers of mud and brick. In the oldest layers, they find tightly packed houses, busy streets, trash heaps full of broken pots and bones. Signs of life everywhere. But in the newer layers, things get quieter. Fewer houses, more empty lots. Sometimes whole neighborhoods are just gone. The signs are clear. People left. Maybe they died, maybe they moved. But the city shrank. In places like Uruk, another huge city nearby, the story is the same. Archaeologists counted houses and graves from century to century. They found that after a boom, the number of burials drops sharply. In some layers, there are only half as many graves as before. That means fewer people were living and dying in the city. Why would people leave a city that was once the center of everything? Sometimes it's war, sometimes it's hunger. Other times, life just gets too hard, and people drift away looking for something better. These population drops are some of the earliest warning signs that things aren't going well. Next up, signs of poor health. When cities decline, people usually suffer. We can see this in their bones. Archaeologists look for clues like broken bones that never healed, teeth with cavities or skeletons showing signs of malnutrition. In the last years of Ur and other cities in Mesopotamia, the evidence points to hard times. Bones from the later layers show more children who died young, more adults with signs of starvation, thin bones, stunted growth, and diseases caused by bad nutrition. Teeth tell their own story. In good years, most people have healthy teeth. In bad years, you find more cavities, abscesses, and tooth loss, all signs of a poor diet. Sometimes skulls show grooves and marks from anemia, which means people weren't getting enough iron. These are not just numbers. Each skeleton is a person who struggled. The evidence says life got harder right before the end. Let's talk about housing. In a healthy city, homes are rebuilt and improved. Over time, you see new walls, thicker bricks, better roofs. But when things fall apart, houses get smaller. Sometimes old homes are split up into tiny rooms. People squeeze into whatever space they can find. In Ur, in the last phase, you see this everywhere. Big family houses become crowded with different people, maybe not even related, all sharing the same space. The quality drops too. Walls aren't as strong, doors get patched, not replaced. People use whatever scraps they can find. Broken pottery is stuffed into cracks. Roofs leak. It's a picture of people just trying to get by, not build something better. Now, look at the trash. It sounds funny, but ancient garbage is a goldmine for clues. In good years, the trash is full of food scraps, fancy pottery, and imported goods. But in bad times, the trash changes. You see more broken tools patched up again and again. Pottery is reused until it falls apart. People eat less meat, more cheap grains and weeds. In some collapsed cities, archaeologists even found animal bones from pets, dogs and cats eaten for food. That's a bad sign. Another big clue is trade. Remember how and other big cities depended on long-distance trade? When things go wrong, those trade networks break down. The evidence shows up in what people leave behind. In the best years you find lots of foreign goods, lapis lazuli, copper, tin, silver. But in times of decline, those goods disappear. The pottery is local, plain and simple. Tools are made from whatever's nearby. In some layers, you find imported goods mixed with weapons and burned debris. That usually means the city was attacked and the trade routes were cut off. After these layers, foreign goods almost vanish. The city is cut off, left to survive on its own. Writing is another clue. Early cities loved to write things down. Laws, deals, stories, prayers. But as cities decline, the number of clay tablets drops. In thousands of tablets come from the city's golden age. But in the last years, only a handful are found. The stories stop. The records dry up. Maybe there were fewer scribes, or maybe people just stopped caring. Sometimes the writing changes too. Early records are careful, neat, full of detail. Later ones get sloppy, rushed, even desperate. Some tablets record last-ditch orders, taxes that can't be collected, debts that can't be paid, pleas for help that never comes. And then there are the signs of violence. As cities weaken, enemies circle. You see this in the evidence of war: burned buildings, smashed walls, skeletons with wounds from swords or arrows. In some cities like Ebla or Mari, there are whole layers of black ash, mixed with broken pottery and crushed bones. Sometimes you find mass graves, full of people who died suddenly, maybe in a final battle. Coins and seals sometimes show the same story. Early coins are full of proud symbols, kings, gods, victories. But in the last years, coins get smaller, cheaper and less detailed. Seals that once showed powerful rulers now show desperate prayers for protection. Another warning sign is the breakdown of order. Cities run on rules, but in bad times those rules break down. We see this in the law codes and in the way people treat the dead. Early graves are neat with careful burials and offerings. Later graves get rushed, sometimes just bodies dumped in pits, no grave goods, no ceremony. It's a sign that society's falling apart. You also see hoarding. In the last years of more people hid valuables in the ground. Jewelry, coins, tools. They buried them under floors or in jars, maybe hoping to come back for them later. Most never did. Archaeologists find these stashes, untouched for thousands of years. It's a sign of fear. People didn't feel safe, so they hid what mattered most. Climate is another piece of the puzzle. It's not always obvious, but when you look at mud layers, riverbeds, and old pollen, you start to see patterns. In the decades before Ur's fall, the climate got drier. Tree rings and soil samples show longer droughts. The rivers shrank. Canals filled with silt. Crops failed more often. In some places, you can see fields turning to desert in just a few decades. This drought wasn't just local. All across Mesopotamia, cities started to struggle at the same time. Farmland turned brown. People fought over water. When the river ran low there, wasn't enough to go around. Fights broke out between cities, sometimes over nothing more than a patch of mud or a trickle of water. Disease can be another clue, though it's harder to spot. In crowded cities, one bad sickness could kill thousands. Sometimes you see sharp drops in population that match the spread of plague or fever. Skeletons packed into graves, no time for rituals, just a rush to bury the dead and move on. Here's another sign: the temples themselves. In good years, temples are rebuilt, decorated, filled with offerings. But in the last years, temples get shabby. Repairs are left undone. The offerings shrink. Instead of gold and silver, you find simple clay figures, or nothing at all. Sometimes the temples are looted, either by enemies or by desperate locals. Letters from the time tell the same story. Some surviving tablets are full of complaints, officials begging the king for help, saying the workers have run away, the grain has run out, the army is gone. One letter from a city near Ur says, "There is no grain, there is no beer, there is no meat, the city is dying." It's raw, desperate stuff. Even the art changes. Early on you see rich carvings, lively scenes, proud kings. In later years art gets rougher, smaller, less hopeful. Sometimes you see pictures of gods leaving the city, boats carrying statues of gods away, as if even the divine powers have given up. Money troubles show up too. In the records you see more debts, more loans going unpaid, more people losing land or being sold into slavery to pay what they owe. The system stops working. People start to hoard food and wealth. Trust fades away. As things get worse, people stop building new things. There are fewer big projects, no new temples, no new walls, no new canals. Instead, you see patchwork repairs. People do the minimum needed to keep things from falling apart. It's a sign that hope is fading. Sometimes you see the rise of strong men, local leaders who take power when the king is weak. These leaders might be popular at first, but often they rule through force. The city turns inward. Fights break out between neighborhoods. The sense of being one city, one people, starts to disappear. Trade routes shift. When the old ways stop working, people look for new paths. But in times of crisis, new routes are risky. Bandits are common. Caravans get robbed. Merchants stop coming. The city's markets shrink. The sense of being connected to a bigger world fades away. Evidence from other cities tells the same story. In Egypt, during the first intermediate period, monuments stop being built. Tombs are smaller, rougher. In the Indus Valley, at places like Mohenjo-Daro, the city's drains clog up, houses are abandoned, and the famous baked bricks are replaced with cheaper, weaker ones. In the end, people just walk away. Let's pause and think about what all these signs mean. They're not just random facts, they paint a picture of what happens when a city starts to fall apart. At first, the changes are small. Fewer traders in the market, a little less food on the table, houses that don't get fixed. But over time, these small cracks become big breaks. The city's systems, trade, government, religion, law start to fail. And here's what's strange. Sometimes, the people living through these times didn't even realize how bad things had gotten. When you're inside the crisis, it can feel normal. You adjust, make do, hope things will get better. But from the outside, the signs are clear. The city is in trouble. Some people fought to save their cities. They built new walls, made new alliances, tried new religions. Sometimes it worked for a while, but often it just delayed the collapse. There's one last sign to mention: stories. Myths and legends from these cities change when things go wrong. Early stories are full of hope. Heroes, victories, the blessings of the gods. Later stories turn dark. Floods, famines, angry gods, cities punished for their sins. Sometimes the stories are about searching for a lost golden age, trying to remember a time when everything worked. People told these stories to make sense of what was happening. When everything falls apart, you want a reason. You want to believe there's a bigger plan, or at least a lesson to be learned. So what can we learn from these signs? First, that decline is rarely sudden. It's a process, not a moment. There are warning signs if you know how to read them. Second, that cities are fragile things. They depend on a web of systems: food, water, trade, trust. Break enough links, and the whole thing can fall apart. But here's the thing: collapse isn't always the end. Sometimes people come back. They rebuild. Sometimes a new city rises in the old one's place. The ruins become the foundation for something new. Still, the signs are there for anyone who wants to look. Fewer people, sicker people, smaller houses, broken trade, faded writing, violence, desperation in the records, art and temples falling apart, stories turning dark. All these are evidence that the world's first cities weren't as stable as they looked. It's not a story about failure. It's a story about how hard it is to keep a complex society going. Every city faces its own challenges. Some last, some fall. But all of them leave behind clues, traces in the ground, in bones, in old stories, that help us understand what went wrong. And that brings us to the next big question. If these warning signs were showing up everywhere, what actually pushed these cities over the edge? What turned slow decline into sudden collapse? That's where things get dramatic. Because sometimes, after years of warning, everything falls apart at once. So let's get into the moment everything actually fell apart. All those warning signs built up, layer after layer, but eventually there comes a point where the whole system just can't take it anymore. That's the collapse, when the city goes from struggling to gone. It's not always dramatic like in the movies, with armies at the gates and flames in the night. Sometimes it's slow, sometimes it's sudden. Either way, the end leaves a mark on history you can't miss. Let's start with since it's one of the best studied examples. Picture the city near the end. The grand walls are cracked, canals are full of mud. The ziggurat, the giant step temple, still stands, but it's quiet around it. The streets are emptier, the markets are thin. In some neighbourhoods, houses stand empty, doors swinging on broken hinges, and then, almost all at once, people leave. We know this because the newest layers in Nier have almost nothing in them. A few broken pots, some scattered bones, and then silence. Archaeologists call this an abandonment layer. It's a fancy way of saying nothing much happened here after the city fell. All that busy life stopped. You can see the same thing in Uruk and in other cities up and down the rivers. In the final layers, the buildings are left unfinished or in ruins. There are signs of fire in some places, black streaks on the walls, piles of ash mixed with broken bricks, but not everywhere. Sometimes it looks like people just packed up and left. Let's talk about what the evidence actually looks like. When cities really collapse, you get what archaeologists call destruction layers. These are thick bands of debris, burned wood, smashed pottery, sometimes even collapsed walls. In Mari, a famous city farther up the river, there's a layer almost 2 feet thick. It's full of rubble, burned beams, and the skeletons of people who died when the city was attacked. What's wild is that you can date these layers pretty closely. In Mari, the destruction matches up with records of a king named Hammurabi who led his army against the city. The records say he conquered Mari and burned it. The evidence in the ground backs this up. You find the sudden stop in writing, the sudden drop in foreign goods, and then the thick layer of ash. But not every collapse is caused by war. Sometimes it's more like a slow fade. In the Indus Valley, at places like Mohenjo-daro, you don't see a big destruction layer. Instead, you see houses slowly falling apart. Drains clog up. Streets fill with trash. People move out, a few at a time, until the city is empty. In the final layers, you find almost nothing, just empty rooms and broken pots. That's important. Collapse doesn't always mean fire and blood. Sometimes it's just people giving up, walking away, hoping for a better life somewhere else. Now, let's look at Egypt. Around 2200 BCE, the Old Kingdom, the age of the pyramids, came to a close. The records from this time are full of fear and confusion. There are letters from officials saying, "The villages are empty, the fields are dry, the people have left." Tombs stop being built. The Great Pyramids stand alone, surrounded by sand. In the cities you see houses abandoned, walls crumbling. It's like the country just stopped working. What's really interesting is how you can see this pattern in the land itself. In the Nile Delta, there are layers of silt, fine river mud that build up during floods. But around the time of the collapse, the floods get weaker. The layers are thinner. It's like the river itself is tired. Crops fail. People can't get enough food. And then, over just a few decades, whole towns vanish. Archaeologists found whole villages in the Nile Valley that were suddenly left empty. Their cooking pots still on the fire, tools dropped in the street, half-finished bread left behind. It's like people left in a hurry. Maybe they were running from hunger, or violence, or just the sense that life was better somewhere else. Let's jump to another place, the city of Ebla in what's now Syria. Ebla was rich and powerful for hundreds of years. It traded with faraway lands, built great palaces, and filled its temples with treasures. But then, in the middle of a busy period, disaster struck. The evidence is clear. A huge fire swept through the palace. The walls are blackened, rooms are filled with ash. The famous library, full of clay tablets, was baked hard in the heat. That's why those records survived. But after the fire, the city never really recovered. For a while, people tried to rebuild. You see patchwork repairs, new walls built on top of old ruins. But the new city is smaller, poorer, and less organized. The art changes. Gone are the grand statues, replaced by simple carvings. Eventually, the city is left behind for good. Now, let's talk about the Indus Valley again, because its collapse is a real mystery. Mohenjo-daro and Harappa were huge cities. They had straight streets, sewers, wells, and big public buildings. There's no sign of war or big fires at the end. Instead, you see things just stop. The last layers are full of broken bricks, clogged drains, and tiny houses squeezed into old spaces. Some houses look like they were never finished. Tools are dropped on the floor. There are fewer fancy goods, almost no writing. People seem to have left bit by bit. Maybe it was drought. Maybe the river changed course. Maybe people just moved away. But the cities emptied out, and the civilization faded from history. Moving west, let's look at the city of Hattusa. This was the capital of the Hittite Empire, up in what's now Turkey. Hattusa was a fortress city, surrounded by huge stone walls. It was the center of a great kingdom, but around 1200 BCE it fell apart. The final layers are full of fire and rubble. The city was burned, the walls smashed, the palaces ruined. Who did it? That's still up for debate. Some say invaders, the so-called Sea People, came out of nowhere and attacked cities all across the eastern Mediterranean. In Hattusa, the destruction is so complete that the city was never rebuilt. After the fire, grass and trees grew over the ruins. People moved away. The empire was gone. That's another key point. When a city collapses, it's not just bricks and stones that are lost. It's entire ways of life. Languages disappear. Traditions vanish. The skills to build giant temples or write in strange scripts. Sometimes those are lost forever. Let's look at one more case. The fall of Mycenae in Greece. Mycenae was famous for its huge stone walls and golden treasures. Its kings ruled over a network of smaller towns. Around 1200 BCE, something went badly wrong. The last layers in the city show burned buildings, smashed pottery, and hurried burials. Some people died violently. Skeletons with broken bones, wounds from swords or spears. After this, the city empties out. The writing, the famous Linear B script, disappears. The people who remain live in simple huts, using rough pottery. The old palaces are never rebuilt. For hundreds of years, Greece enters a dark age. Writing is forgotten. Trade shrinks. People farm and herd sheep, but the great cities are gone. So what does all this evidence actually tell us? It shows that collapse can happen in many ways. Sometimes it's war. Cities burned and smashed. People killed or taken away. Sometimes it's drought or famine. Fields dry up, people go hungry, and towns are left empty. Other times, it's more mysterious. People just stop showing up, and the city fades away. But in every case, there are signs that something big changed. The layers of burned wood, the sudden drop in fancy goods, the end of writing, the empty houses, these are the marks of collapse. Let's zoom out for a moment and look at the bigger pattern. Around 2200 BCE, there was a wave of collapses across the Middle East and North Africa. Egypt's old kingdom fell. Cities in Mesopotamia shrank or vanished. Even in places as far away as the Indus Valley, cities went quiet. It wasn't just one place, it was a whole region. What else happened at the end of the Bronze Age around 1200 BCE? Another wave of collapses. The Hittite Empire, Mycenae, Ugarit, Troy. Dozens of big cities fell within a few decades. Letters from this time are full of panic. One king wrote, "The enemy is at the gates. My people are hungry. My city is burning. Send help." No help came. It's not just dramatic stories either. The evidence is physical. In Ugarit, you can see a layer of burned earth mixed with the remains of buildings, tools, and even food left behind on the fire. In Cyprus, cities that had traded for centuries were suddenly empty. Pottery styles change overnight. Writing stops. The trade routes that once linked Egypt, Greece, and the Near East break down. And here's something strange. In many places, after collapse, nobody moves back for a long time. The cities are left as ruins. Nature takes over. In some cases, it's hundreds of years before people come back and build again. But sometimes you get a new kind of life. In Mesopotamia, after the collapse, small villages pop up in the ruins of old cities. People farm and herd animals, but they don't build anything as big as before. In Egypt, local rulers take over. The country splits into small regions, each with its own leaders. The old unity is gone. So what do we actually see in the ground and in the records? It's a mix. Sometimes sudden destruction, fire, smashed walls, mass graves. Other times, slow decline, empty houses, broken tools, faded writing. Always there's a sense of loss. Something big has ended. There are even clues in the DNA of people who lived after the collapse. Studies of ancient skeletons show changes in the population. New groups move in. Sometimes you see signs of mixing, people from far away settling in the ruins of old cities. It's like the collapse opened the door for new cultures. Let's not forget about the animals and plants. In places like the Indus Valley, you see changes in what people ate. After the cities fell, people ate more wild plants and hunted animals instead of farming big fields. In Egypt, after the collapse, the bones of cattle and sheep become rarer. People switch to animals that need less water. It's survival mode. And in the art, you see a shift. The grand statues and carvings stop. Instead, you find small, simple objects, charms, amulets, little clay figurines. Maybe these were for protection or luck. When you live in hard times, you reach for whatever comfort you can find. What about writing? After the collapse, writing often disappears. In Mycenae, the linear B script is gone. In the Indus Valley, the script is never used again. In Egypt, writing continues, but it's less grand, less confident. The stories are different too, more about struggle, loss, and hope for a return to better days. One last thing to notice: the cemeteries. In good times, people are buried with care. In bad times, burials get rushed. Sometimes you find mass graves. Sometimes you find bodies just left in the street or buried under the floor of a house. The respect for the dead changes. Maybe people were too busy staying alive. Maybe they lost faith that things would ever get better. Let's pause and pull it all together. What's the big picture from all this evidence? Collapse isn't just one thing. It's not always about war or drought or disease. It's all of these, sometimes at once, sometimes in a row. It's a shock to the whole system, a point where things can't go on as they were. When you walk through the ruins of these old cities today, you can see the marks of collapse everywhere. Broken walls, empty streets, pots left where they fell. Sometimes you can even feel a sense of quiet, like the city is still waiting for its people to come back. But the evidence also shows something else. Even after the worst collapses, people kept living. Maybe not in great cities, maybe not with golden statues and busy markets, but they survived. They built new homes, learned new ways of doing things, and told new stories. The fall of the world's first cities wasn't the end of the world, but it was the end of a certain way of living, a way built on big buildings, long-distance trade, powerful kings, and fancy writing. When those things disappeared, something simpler took their place, and in a strange way, collapse left room for new ideas. After every big fall, you see a burst of change. New languages, new kinds of art, new religions. Sometimes new cities rise up in the ruins of the old. People remember the past, but they also move forward. So when you look at the evidence, the burned buildings, the empty houses, the broken pots, the lost writing, it tells a story of both loss and change. The first cities were grand, but they were also fragile. When their systems broke, the collapse was hard. But it wasn't the end of people. It was just the end of that chapter, and that's the real mystery. Why did so many cities fall at the same time? Was it just bad luck? Was it something bigger? Climate, disease, enemies, or something we still don't understand? The evidence gives us clues, but not all the answers. Still, when you see how the world's first cities ended, you can't help but wonder. What would it have felt like to be there as the city emptied out? To see the markets close, the temples grow quiet, the writings stop? Would you have stayed, hoping for things to get better? Or would you have left, looking for a fresh start somewhere new? The evidence is silent on that. It gives us facts but not feelings. But it does show us that every ending is also a beginning. The old cities fell, but people kept going. They changed, adapted, and built new lives. And that's the most important evidence of all. Now that we've seen what actually happened, how these cities came to an end, each in their own way, we can start to dig into the big question. Why? What caused the collapses? Was it something inside the cities, or did the trouble come from outside? That's where the real debate begins, and it's a puzzle historians are still trying to solve. So we've seen what the collapse of the world's first cities looked like. Ruins, ashes, silent streets, and lost ways of life. But now comes the big question. Why did it happen? What actually brought those early cities down? It's one of the oldest mysteries in history. People have argued about it for centuries. Even today, there isn't one simple answer. Instead, there are many theories, some based on facts, some on guesswork, and some that sound almost like stories. Let's walk through the main ideas people have come up with. We'll look at the evidence for each one and see what they tell us about how ancient cities could fall apart. The first theory almost always brought up is war and invasion. It's the classic idea. Enemies at the gates, armies burning, cities, people running for their lives. And honestly, sometimes this is exactly what happened. Take the city of Mari, for example. Archaeologists found a thick layer of burned wood and rubble there, matching up with ancient records about Hammurabi's army attacking the city. The destruction was quick and violent. You see smashed pottery, skeletons in the ruins, and buildings torched from the inside out. This is war at its worst, and it leaves a clear mark. But here's the thing. Not every city shows signs of big battles at the end. In some places, the evidence of war just isn't there. No mass graves, no layers of ash, no weapons scattered around. For those cities, war might not have been the main cause. Still, you can't rule it out completely. Sometimes the destruction was cleaned up later, or the survivors rebuilt right away. Other times, the conquerors took over and kept the city running, so the end wasn't as obvious in the ruins. There's another twist too. Sometimes the real trouble came from people inside the city, not outsiders. Civil war, rebellion, and fights over power could also tear a city apart. Another big theory is climate change. Basically, the weather stops cooperating and people can't grow enough food. This idea shows up a lot when you look at the first cities. Take Egypt, for example. Around 2200 BCE, the Nile's floods got weaker. The river didn't bring enough water to the fields, crops failed, and people went hungry. You see this in the dried up layers of dirt, in letters from scared officials, and in the drop-in tomb building. Mesopotamia had its own struggles. Sometimes the rivers flooded too much, sometimes not enough. If the water didn't come at the right time, fields turned to dust and whole villages could disappear. Drought is a big suspect in the fall of the Indus Valley cities too. Scientists studied ancient lake beds and found signs of long dry spells. If the rains failed for a few years in a row, the big cities would have been in trouble. Not enough food, not enough water, and people forced to leave. Even in Greece, around 1200 BCE, there's evidence of a megadrought, a period when the land dried out and crops died. When fields fail, cities can't survive. It's as simple as that. But climate alone doesn't always explain everything. Some cities kept going even when the weather was bad. Others collapsed even when the climate looked stable. So, while drought and changing weather played a role, they don't tell the whole story. Disease is another theory that gets talked about. Think about it. Cities bring lots of people together. If a new sickness appears, it can spread fast. We know that plagues have wiped out whole towns in later history. But for the earlier cities, the evidence is trickier. Bones don't always show signs of disease. Most germs don't leave a mark in the ground. Still, there are some clues. In the ancient city of Haminmanga in China, archaeologists found a mass grave from about 5,000 years ago. Hundreds of skeletons were piled together, many with signs of a sudden disaster. Some scientists think it was a deadly epidemic. There are stories too, ancient texts warning about bad air, or the hand of the gods striking people down. These could have been early ways to explain disease. In crowded cities with little sanitation, a new sickness could spread like wildfire. If enough people died, the city might not recover. Even if most survived, fear could drive people to leave. Now let's talk about economics. This is a fancy word for how people make, trade, and use things. Early cities depended on trade, moving goods like grain, wool, metals, and pottery between towns. Sometimes a city's whole reason for existing was to connect different regions. But trade is fragile. If the roads or rivers became unsafe, or if one key partner collapsed, everything could grind to a halt. Take the city of Ugarit on the Syrian coast. Ugarit was a trading powerhouse linking Egypt, Anatolia, and Mesopotamia. But around 1200 BCE, trade networks broke down. Ships stopped coming. Markets emptied out. The city couldn't survive on its own. You can see the same thing in Cyprus and other places. Pottery styles change, showing that old trading partners were gone. When the big cities fell, the smaller towns that relied on them often couldn't make it either. Economic trouble can start a chain reaction. If a city depends on imports for food or metal and those supplies stop, people get desperate. Prices go up. Some starve, others leave. Sometimes the city leaders try to fix things by raising taxes or making strict rules. But that can just make people more angry. Here's another idea. Maybe the cities got too big and complicated for their own good. This is the systems collapse theory. Early cities worked because lots of systems, water, food, government, trade, worked together smoothly. But as the cities grew, these systems got more tangled. More people meant more mouths to feed, more trash to deal with, more rules to enforce. Small problems could turn into big ones fast. Imagine a city where the canals are clogged, the roads are crowded, and the leaders are arguing over what to do. If one system fails, say the water stops flowing, it can mess up everything else. People can't drink, crops die, disease spreads, and trade stalls. If there isn't a good way to fix things, the city can spiral downwards. Historians call this a tipping point, when small troubles build up until the whole system breaks. Once that happens, people may just give up and leave. This brings us to another theory, leadership failure. Sometimes the people in charge just couldn't handle the crisis. Maybe the king was weak, or the priests fought with the merchants. Maybe the government was too harsh, or too slow to change. In Egypt's Old Kingdom, records show officials begging for help, but not getting what they needed. In some Mesopotamian cities, the king's name disappears from records, replaced by new leaders every year. That's a sign of chaos at the top. When leaders can't solve problems or make them worse, people lose faith. They stop following the rules. They look for answers somewhere else. Here's an example. The end of Akkad, one of the first big empires in Mesopotamia. There's a story, written hundreds of years later, about a king who couldn't control the land. The people stopped listening. The empire broke into small pieces. Maybe the story isn't exact, but it fits what we see in the ruins. A sudden drop in big building projects, smaller towns taking over, and the old ways fading away. Now, let's talk about migration. People moving in or out of cities. Sometimes a city grows so fast that it runs out of space or resources. Newcomers might not fit in. There could be fights over land, jobs, or power. In other cases, people leave because life gets too hard. Maybe the fields are dry, or there's not enough work, or the city leaders are cruel. When enough people leave, the city can't function. There's another side to this too. Sometimes new groups move in after a collapse. They might bring different languages, customs, or ways of farming. In the ruins of old cities, archaeologists sometimes find houses built in a different style, or bones showing new diets. This mixing can create new cultures, but it can also cause tension. Another theory people talk about is technology change. Sometimes the tools or weapons that made a city strong become useless. For example, at the end of the Bronze Age, people learned to make iron tools and weapons. Iron was stronger and easier to get than bronze, which needed special metals from far away. As iron spread, the old trade networks fell apart. Cities that depended on bronze lost their edge. New groups with iron weapons could take over. You see this in the layers of ruins, old bronze tools replaced by simple iron ones. But technology cuts both ways. Sometimes new inventions help cities survive. Other times they shake up the whole system. If leaders can't adapt, the city can get left behind. Nature can play tricks too. Floods, earthquakes, or volcanoes can wipe out a city overnight. In the city of Akrotiri, on the island of Santorini, a huge volcanic eruption buried the whole place in ash. The people probably escaped, but the city was lost for good. In Mesopotamia, floods sometimes swept away whole neighborhoods. Earthquakes could knock down walls, break canals, and start fires. When disaster hits and people are already struggling, it can be the final blow. But natural disasters alone rarely explain a whole region collapsing. Usually they're just one part of a bigger puzzle. Here's a different idea: social change. Maybe people simply got tired of city life, or they lost faith in the old ways. When things got hard, some might have turned to new leaders or new gods. You see hints of this in the art and writing after a collapse. Old styles disappear. New, simpler forms take over. Sometimes there's a rise in small personal objects, charms, amulets, or little statues. Maybe people were looking for comfort, or trying to make sense of what happened. In some cases, the city itself might have become too crowded, too dirty, or too divided. If people didn't feel safe, or if the community broke down, they might have chosen to leave. Maybe they hoped for a better life in the countryside or in a new village. Another theory is that climate and environment changed slowly over time, not just in sudden disasters. Rivers can shift course over decades. Forests can shrink as people cut down trees for fuel or building. Soils can wear out if they're farmed too hard. When the land can't support the city anymore, people have to move. Let's look at the evidence from the Indus Valley. Some scientists think a river, called the Ghaggar Hakra, which once flowed by many cities, slowly dried up or changed course. Without water, farming got harder. The big cities shrank, then faded away. It wasn't sudden. It was a slow squeeze, year after year, until staying just wasn't possible. One more theory gets less attention, but it's worth thinking about: luck and chance. Sometimes things just go wrong. A few bad years of weather, a leader making the wrong call, a few neighbors turning hostile. Add them up, and a city that seemed strong can come apart. it's not always a grand story. Sometimes it's just a long series of small problems piling up. Here's what's interesting. Most experts today think there isn't a single reason why the first cities fell. Instead, it's a mix, a perfect storm of problems coming together. War, drought, disease, bad leadership, economic trouble, and natural disasters might all hit at once, or in a row. If the city is strong, it might handle one or two problems. But if too many troubles come together, the balance tips and collapse follows. Think about dominoes. One falls, then another, and soon the whole line is down. That's how these old cities sometimes fell. One system failed, then another, until there was nothing left to hold things together. Some experts call this multi-causal collapse. It means there's no single villain. Instead, lots of stresses build up, and the city just can't recover. It's like a ship with too many leaks. You can patch one or two, but if the water keeps coming, the ship will sink. So, what can we learn from all these theories? First, that cities are more fragile than they look. It takes a lot of work to keep everything running. Food, water, trade, order, and hope. If too many things go wrong, even the greatest cities can fall. But we can also see that people are resourceful. After collapse, survivors didn't just give up. They moved, adapted, and tried new things. Some built smaller villages. Others learned new ways to farm or trade. Sometimes the fall of a city opened the door for new cultures, new languages, and new ideas. It's easy to look at the ruins and see only loss. But there's another story, a story of change and of new beginnings. Collapse is not just an end, it's also a turning point. When old ways break down, new ones have a chance to grow. Experts are still arguing about which theory matters most. Some say drought was the key. Others blame war or trade or leadership. The truth is probably different in every city. In some places, nature played the biggest part. In others, it was people's choices, or bad luck, or just too many problems at once. When you look at the evidence, layers of ash, broken walls, empty houses, you can see the fingerprints of all these forces. No single clue tells the whole tale. It's only by looking at the big picture across many cities and centuries that we start to understand. And here's a thought. Maybe the most important lesson from these ancient collapses isn't about how things ended, but how people kept going. Every collapse opened a space for something new. New leaders, new customs, new hopes. The people who survived found ways to start over. So when we ask why the world's first cities fell, we're also asking how people respond to crisis. Do they cling to the old ways, or do they look for something different? Do they fight change or adapt to it? The ruins don't give us all the answers, but they remind us that nothing lasts forever, except, maybe, the human drive to rebuild. Now, let's look forward. All these theories about ancient collapse might seem far away, but they raise questions that matter even today. Are our own cities as strong as we think? What kinds of problems could tip the balance? And what can we learn from the past to help us face whatever comes next? That's where the story heads from here. So after all the talk about collapse, you might wonder, did anything actually survive? Did everything just vanish? Or did some ideas, skills, or traditions carry through the wreckage? Here's what's surprising. Even when cities fell, not everything disappeared. Some things stuck around. Others changed shape but kept going. It's not a story of total loss. It's a story of picking up the pieces and starting again. Let's think about writing first. The world's first real writing came from places like Sumer, Egypt, and the Indus Valley. When those cities fell, you might expect writing to vanish overnight, but that didn't really happen. In Mesopotamia, cuneiform, the wedge-shaped writing on clay, kept going long after the big cities crumbled. Even when empires broke apart, scribes still kept records, copied old stories, and taught writing to new generations. Some of these scribes worked in small towns, not big capitals. They wrote contracts, prayers, and even personal letters. In Egypt, the story was similar. Hieroglyphs, those picture words carved on stone, stayed in use. Even when the Old Kingdom collapsed, scribes kept writing. Some switched to a simpler script called hieratic, which was easier to write on papyrus. Old stories, religious beliefs, and government rules got passed down. Later dynasties built on the writing of earlier times. And in the Indus Valley, that's where it gets tricky. We still can't read their script. But after the big cities like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa faded, some symbols kept showing up on pottery and small objects in smaller villages. Maybe people kept using bits of the old system, even if they changed it. It's like the memory of writing hung on, even after the big city life was gone. Now, let's look at farming. You might think that when a city falls, people scatter and forget how to grow food. But farming was too important to lose. Most survivors moved to smaller villages or the countryside. They took seeds, tools, and knowledge with them. Wheat, barley, and other crops that first showed up in the world's earliest cities kept growing in nearby fields. Irrigation, using canals to water crops, survived too. Even after the canals of Ur or Babylon got clogged or broken, people fixed smaller sections or dug new ones. In Egypt, farmers still used the Nile's floodwaters, just as they always had. Sometimes they went back to older, simpler ways when the big city systems failed, but they didn't give up on farming. Animals like sheep, goats, and cattle kept being raised. Herding never stopped. People who left the cities took their flocks with them. In some places, they even mixed city farming with older ways of hunting and gathering. What about religion? That's a big one. When cities fell, temples sometimes burned or got buried. Statues of gods were smashed or stolen. But old beliefs didn't just vanish. Often people kept worshipping in smaller, simpler ways. They made little clay figurines, wore amulets or carved symbols on stones. Some gods changed names or forms, but the core ideas lived on. In Mesopotamia, new towns still built small shrines to the same ancient gods. Even if the big ziggurats, those step-shaped temples, fell, the stories and rituals survived. In Egypt, the names of the old gods kept showing up in new dynasties. Later rulers claimed to be chosen by the same gods as the pharaohs before them. Even in places like the Indus Valley, where we know less about religion, small carved seals with animal symbols kept being made after the big cities were gone. Maybe these were still used for rituals or magic. Maybe they were worn for luck or protection. It's hard to say for sure, but the symbols didn't just vanish. Let's talk about tools and technology. When you look at the ruins, you'll see broken pottery, stone tools, and scraps of metal. Did people forget how to make these things after a collapse? Not really. Pottery styles might change, but the skill of shaping clay and firing it stayed. In some places, people went back to simpler designs. Maybe they didn't have time or resources for fancy decorations, but cups, bowls, and jars kept being made. Metalworking is another good example. Bronze, the shiny metal made from mixing copper and tin, was a big deal in the old cities. When trade broke down, it got harder to get tin. Some people switched to using more copper, or even went back to stone tools for a while. But the know-how didn't disappear. Later, when iron became important, people learned how to smelt iron ore and make new kinds of tools. The skills shifted, but they didn't die out. Weaving and spinning are much the same. People still needed clothes. Even after a collapse, women and men spun thread and wove cloth in small homes and huts. The types of patterns and colours might change, but the basic skills were passed down from parent to child. Now, here's something interesting. Trade didn't end completely, it just changed shape. The big networks, the connected far-off cities broke down, but local and regional trade kept going. People still swapped goods with neighbours. Salt, shells, beads and food moved from village to village. Sometimes old trade routes got used by new groups. Sometimes new paths opened up as people moved to different places. Think about obsidian, the black volcanic glass used for sharp tools. Even after some cities fell, obsidian from certain mountains kept showing up hundreds of miles away. That means people still travelled, traded and shared ideas. Storytelling is another thing that survived. When cities collapse, you might lose libraries and official records, but you don't lose stories. People told tales about the past, about great kings, lost cities, gods and monsters. Some of these stories got written down much later. Others changed with each telling, but the core memories stayed alive. In Mesopotamia, the story of Gilgamesh, a king who searched for eternal life, was told and retold for centuries. Even after his city faded, the legend survived. In Egypt, tales about old pharaohs, magic and creation kept being passed down. These stories helped people make sense of the world and gave them hope for better days. Now, let's talk about art. You might think art disappears in hard times, but it's actually pretty stubborn. When big statues and grand paintings are no longer possible, people still make small carvings, decorate pottery, or weave patterns into cloth. In fact, after a collapse, art often gets more personal. You see little charms, simple drawings, and homemade jewellery. People make art to remember, to comfort themselves, or just to pass the time. Music is even harder to find in the ruins. Bones don't sing and clay tablets don't play songs. But there are clues. Ancient flutes, rattles, and drums have been found in small villages, made from bone or clay. Music is easy to carry in your head. You don't need a city for a song. What about language? Here's the thing. Languages change, but they don't just vanish. When cities fall, people scatter. They bring their words with them. New dialects form. Old words get mixed with new ones. Sometimes a language that started in a city keeps going in the countryside. Sometimes it grows, taking in words from other groups. Even when writing disappears, spoken language survives. In the ruins of old Sumerian cities, people started speaking Akkadian, a different language. But Sumerian words stuck around in religion and law for hundreds of years. In Egypt, the ancient language slowly changed, but some words lasted for thousands of years. Now, what about government and laws? When a big city government fails, you'd think order falls apart. But people don't just stop making rules. In the ruins, you find clay tablets and carved stones with lists of laws or agreements between neighbours. Even after the old kings were gone, people made new leaders, village chiefs, elders, or priests. In some places, the old ways of settling arguments or trading goods kept going, just in simpler forms. People still needed to know who owned what, who owed what, and how to solve fights. Some rules were remembered, some were made up on the spot. It wasn't always perfect, but the idea of making agreements and keeping order didn't vanish. Let's not forget about houses and building styles. When cities fall, the grand palaces and temples might crumble, but people still need places to live. In many areas, people built smaller houses with mud bricks or stone just like before. Some reused old city walls or cleared out ruined temples to make space. You see the old building tricks passed down: how to build a roof, how to keep out rain, how to store food safely. In some places, new groups moved into the ruins and put their own stamp on things. Maybe they built houses in a new layout or used different materials. But bits of the old ways mixed with the new. The ruins weren't just dead stone, they were recycled, reshaped, and made useful again. Let's talk about clothing. Fashion changes, of course, but the basic skills to make and mend clothes don't go away. In smaller villages, people still spun thread from flax or wool, wove it into cloth, and stitched simple tunics or robes. Some styles from the big cities stuck around for centuries, especially if they were practical. Even jewellery didn't disappear. Simple beads, shells, and metal rings kept being made and worn. Food traditions are another survivor. Recipes change, ingredients come and go, but people hold on to what works. Ways of baking bread, brewing beer, or making cheese can last for generations. Even if city feasts ended, home-cooked meals continued. Sometimes food actually becomes more important after a collapse, since it's a way to remember better times or celebrate together. Medicine is a tricky one. The old city doctors, with their tablets and tools, might be gone, but folk remedies, herbal, cures, and old recipes for treating illness keep going. Some knowledge passes through families, whispered from grandmother to child. A plant that healed wounds in the city is still used in the country. Some old spells and prayers for healing survive too. Travel and exploration don't stop either. When cities fall, roads might get rough and bridges might break. But people keep moving, for trade, for family, for hope of a better life. Old paths turn into new trails. Stories from travellers help connect small villages. Even when the big highways are gone, people share news, ideas, and objects along the way. What about the idea of the city itself? You might think that after a collapse, people would never want to try city life again. But they do. Sometimes, after a few generations, people gather in new places and start building again. The dream of living together, sharing resources, and building something bigger than a single family doesn't disappear. In some regions, new cities rise right on top of the old ones. You find layer after layer, each with its own pottery, walls, and streets. The names might change, but the spot stays important. In other places, new towns spring up nearby, using old city stones for new walls. The idea of urban life, markets, temples, shared spaces, keeps returning. Here's something else. Knowledge moves. When a city falls, its people don't just vanish. Some move to other cities, taking their skills and ideas with them. You see this in the spread of pottery styles, building tricks, and even religious symbols. Sometimes what survived wasn't a thing, but a way of thinking. Take the story of iron. When bronze got hard to find, some people learned to make iron tools. That knowledge spread city by city until a whole new age began. The end of one way of life became the start of another. Even after collapse, people kept asking questions. How do you plant crops better? How do you keep water clean? How do you make your house stronger? The search for answers didn't stop. New problems forced new solutions. And here's a thought. Sometimes what survived was the memory of what had been lost. People looked at old ruins and wondered about the past. They told stories about golden ages, wise kings, and mighty gods. These memories shaped what they tried to build next. Sometimes they tried to copy the old ways. Other times they went in new directions. In some cases, collapse made people more creative. If the old trade routes were gone, they found new partners. If the big temples fell, they worshipped at home. If food was scarce, they tried new crops or new ways to cook. Even music and dance survived. Wedding songs, funeral chants, and festival dances kept going, even when people had little else. You can't dig up a tune, but you can see the instruments and the marks of rhythm in old bones and broken pots. So, when you look at the first cities, the picture isn't just about loss. It's about survival, change, and new beginnings. Some things faded away, others came back in new forms. People didn't just give up, they adapted, they remembered, they kept going. And maybe that's the biggest thing that survived, the human spirit to rebuild, to learn, and to hope. Even in the darkest times, people found ways to keep the best parts of their world alive. Now let's think about what all this means for us. The first cities left behind more than ruins. They gave us writing, farming, laws, and stories. Even after disaster, much of what they started is still with us. The thread didn't break. It just twisted and turned. As we move forward in the story, keep this in mind. There's always something that endures. Even when the old world falls, seeds of the new world are already growing. That's not just history. It's a lesson for every age. So now that we know some things did survive the collapse of the first cities, what does it actually mean for us today? What echoes from those ancient times can we still hear in our world? It's a big question, but it helps us see why this old story matters. Let's dig in and look at what's still with us, and how those early cities shape the world we're living in now. First, think about the idea of a city itself. Back then, it was a crazy new experiment. Instead of small groups moving around, people started gathering in one place. They built walls, planned streets, made markets, and lived with strangers. This was the first time in history that big groups of people tried to work together every day. That experiment changed everything that came after. Today, most people on Earth live in cities or towns. We take it for granted, but it's a weird idea when you stop to think about it. People packed close together, sharing water, food, and space. It's noisy, messy, and sometimes tough. But it also means more ideas, more teamwork, and more chances for new things to happen. The very first cities taught us how to make rules for living side by side, how to solve problems when so many people want so many different things. Even now, city life is a balancing act. If you ride a bus, wait in a line, or walk through a crowded street, you're part of that same old experiment. The lessons those first city builders learned, how to cooperate, how to share, how to keep the peace, are still at work every day. But that's just part of the story. Let's talk about how those early cities shaped our sense of time. The first city people had to think ahead in new ways. If you're a hunter or a farmer living alone, you worry about today or maybe tomorrow. But if you're running a city, you have to plan for next month, next year, or even longer. Ancient cities started keeping records of grain, taxes, workers, and holidays. They built calendars, watched the stars, and tracked the seasons. All so they could plant, harvest, or throw a festival at the right time. This way of thinking, long-term, careful, always, planning ahead, became part of city life. Now, when you look at a calendar or set a reminder on your phone, you're using a habit that started thousands of years ago. The need to organize time, to know what's coming next, is one of those echoes from the world's first cities. We still live by schedules, plans, and shared routines. Here's another echo, the idea of a shared story. Before cities, most people only knew the stories of their family or their small group. Cities needed bigger stories, legends, histories, and myths that everyone could believe in. These stories helped people feel like they belonged, even if they were strangers. That's where things like national holidays, city festivals, and public parades come from. They're not just for fun. They help a group of strangers feel like a team. When a city celebrates its founding or honors an old hero, it's carrying on a tradition that goes all the way back to Memphis, or Mohenjo-Daro. And it's not just about feeling good. Shared stories help people work together. They give everyone a sense of purpose, a reason to stick together when things get tough. Even today, when we watch fireworks, sing an anthem, or cheer for a local team, we're echoing those old rituals. Let's look at something else, the way cities changed how we think about space. In a city you have public places, squares, markets, temples, or parks, where anyone can go. You also have private spaces, homes, rooms, gardens, where only your group belongs. That sharp divide between public and private was new. It shaped how people acted, dressed, and even thought about themselves. Today we still have this split. There are places for everyone, and places just for you. The way we act at home isn't always the way we act in public. Those old city walls, those first street corners, set the rules for how we move in the world. Now think about money. Early cities invented new ways to trade. At first, people swapped goods, grain for cloth, or fish for pottery. But as cities grew, it got too hard to keep track. So the first tokens, beads, and bits of metal started being used as money. This was a huge shift. Money is really just a shared idea. This little thing stands for value. It let people trade with strangers, pay taxes, and save up for the future. Now, with digital wallets, credit cards, and online banks, money seems complicated. But the basic idea started with those first city markets. That simple trust, a token for a loaf of bread, a shell for a handful of beans, grew into the entire world economy. Here's something you might not expect. Cities also changed how we see ourselves. When you're in a small village, everyone knows you. Your life is shaped by family and old habits. But in a city, you meet new people all the time. You see different jobs, clothes, and beliefs. You can try something new, or even change who you are. Cities gave birth to the idea that you could reinvent yourself. Maybe you were a farmer's kid, but now you're a scribe, a merchant, or a potter. Maybe you came from far away and found a new home. This freedom to choose, to change, is one of the city's greatest gifts. It's still true now. People move to cities for a fresh start, for new chances, for adventure. Let's talk about problems too. Cities aren't just places of progress. They create new risks. Disease spreads faster in crowds. Food can run out if the harvest fails. Arguments can grow into fights or even wars. The first cities faced all these challenges. They had to invent ways to keep people safe, to share resources, to solve fights without violence. That's where early laws, police and public health started. Rules about clean water, fair trade, and safe streets came out of city life. Today, we still wrestle with these problems. Traffic jams, pollution, crime. These are old headaches, just with new names. But the tools we used to solve them started way back in those first busy streets. If you look at modern cities, you'll see the same mix of struggle and hope. Skyscrapers and shacks, bright lights and dark corners, people working together and sometimes getting in each other's way. The lessons from the first cities, how to balance freedom and order, how to live with strangers, how to bounce back after disaster, are still being learned. Now let's look at the idea of progress. The first cities believed in building for the future. They made things to last: walls, temples, statues, and stories. Even after their cities fell, those big dreams inspired others. When later people found the ruins, they wondered who built them and why. Sometimes they tried to copy what they saw. Sometimes they tried to do better. That's still true. We build skyscrapers and highways, but we also look back at the old wonders, the pyramids, ziggurats, and lost cities buried in sand. They remind us that people have always wanted to leave a mark, to make something bigger than themselves, but there's a warning in those ruins too. Every city, no matter how rich or powerful, faced the risk of collapse. Drought, war, bad leaders, or just bad luck could bring it all down. It's a reminder that nothing lasts forever. Even the best ideas have to be cared for, protected, and sometimes changed. And that brings us to one of the most important echoes of all, the habit of learning from failure. The first cities didn't always get it right. Sometimes they built too fast or grew too big. Sometimes they ignored warning signs. But people learned from those mistakes. When one city fell, another learned what not to do. That habit, looking at what went wrong and trying something new, is at the heart of progress. Today, we study history, read old books, and look at the past to figure out what works. It's the same pattern, just with more tools. Here's something to chew on. The first cities invented the idea of the future. Before cities, life changed slowly. You did what your parents did, but city life made people think about tomorrow. What should we build next? How can we fix what's broken? What do we want to remember? And what do we want to leave behind? That's why cities are always changing. New neighborhoods, new buildings, new ideas. The past is never truly gone. It's always there, shaping the choices we make. Let's not forget the small echoes. The food you eat, the way you dress, the stories you tell, all shaped by city life. Bread, beer, cheese, markets, music, even bedtime stories. So many things we think of as normal started in those early cities. Even the idea of home changes in a city. It's not just a house. It's your spot in a bigger world, a street, a neighborhood, a city. You belong to something larger than yourself. That feeling of being part of a crowd, of sharing joys and struggles, is one of the oldest gifts of city life. Now, you might be wondering, if cities shaped so much, why do they still face the same risks as before? Why do they sometimes fall? The answer isn't simple, but it comes down to balance. Cities need to change to survive. The ones that adapt, finding new ways to feed people, keep the peace, or care for the sick, last longer. The ones that dig in and refuse to bend often run into trouble. That's another lesson from the first cities. Flexibility matters. The world changes. Weather, trade, even the land itself. Cities that can shift, that can learn and adjust, tend to recover and even thrive after hard times. But there's also something stubborn about cities. People keep trying again, even after disaster. They rebuild, sometimes right on top of the old ruins. They keep the dream alive. Today, when you look at a busy street or a glowing skyline, you're seeing the same spirit that filled those first cities. The hope that living together can make life better. The belief that sharing space, ideas and dreams is worth. The trouble? Here's one more echo. Cities are places of difference. People from all kinds of backgrounds meet, argue, trade, and sometimes fall in love. That mix is what makes cities exciting and sometimes hard. It's also what makes them strong. New ideas come from mixing. Progress comes from sharing. So, when you think about the world's first cities, don't just picture dusty ruins. Picture the start of a long story that's still going. Picture people trying, failing, learning, and trying again. That's the real gift they gave us. The courage to imagine something bigger, to come together, to start over when we have to. And if you ever feel lost in a crowd or overwhelmed by city life, remember, you're part of a tradition that's thousands of years old. The noise, the lights, the rush. It's all connected to the first time someone built a wall, dug a well, or threw a festival in the square. The world's first cities aren't just history. They're the roots of what we do every day. They gave us more than buildings and broken pots. They gave us the habits of hope, teamwork, and reinvention. The echoes are all around us if you know how to listen. Next, let's take these lessons and see what they can teach us for the future. Because the story isn't finished. The questions those first city dwellers faced are still with us, and the answers we find today will echo for generations to come. Standing at the end of this long story, it's easy to think the world's first cities belong to another universe. Their bricks are dust, their gods are forgotten, their streets are buried under layers of time and soil. But here's the twist. The real story isn't just about what happened back then. It's about how those distant choices shaped what we have today, and what they might mean for the world we're still building. Let's step back and look at the big picture. When the first cities appeared, nothing like them had ever existed. People took a huge risk. They gave up the freedom of wandering for the promise of something bigger. They traded comfort for the chance to build together. They created systems, rules, and new ways of living. And then some of them failed, some crumbled, some were lost. But the idea of city life never died. It spread, changed, and grew. Think about how rare that is in history. Most big changes fade away or get replaced, but cities stuck. Even their failures became lessons for the next round. The ruins became seeds for new growth. That's not just a pattern in ancient times. It's a pattern in every part of life. Try, fail, learn, try again. It's baked into how humans survive. But what can we actually learn from the rise and fall of those first cities? First, there's the reality that no system is ever perfect. Even the most powerful cities had weak spots. Sometimes the problem was the land. Rivers dried up or floods destroyed crops. Sometimes it was the people, arguments, greed, or stubborn leaders. Sometimes it was the weather or disease, things nobody could control. What's interesting is how different cities responded to these problems. Some doubled down on old habits. They built bigger walls, tighter rules, higher temples. Others tried new things, different farming, new leaders, trade with distant neighbours. The cities that lasted the longest were almost always the ones that could bend without breaking. They adapted instead of digging in their heels. If you look at the world today, that lesson still matters. Cities everywhere are facing new risks. Climate change, crowded streets, new diseases, and changing economies. The cities that will last are probably the ones that keep learning, keep adjusting, keep trying new ideas. That's not just true for cities either. It's true for families, businesses, and even for each of us as people. There's another lesson hidden in the story. For all their size and power, cities are fragile. They depend on trust, trust that the water will flow, that the streets will be safe, that food will arrive when it's needed. When that trust breaks, even the biggest city can fall apart fast. We saw that thousands of years ago, and we see it now too. Blackouts, shortages, sudden disasters. These are reminders that big systems only work when people believe in them. That's why even now cities spend so much time building trust. Streetlights, clean water, public spaces, festivals, and even sports. All of these are tools to help people feel like they belong to something stable. The first city leaders might not have had the same words for it, but they understood the need. They built temples, held markets, threw festivals, and made laws, anything to keep the group together. But there's a flip side. Cities can also be places of deep unfairness. The first cities didn't treat everyone the same. Some people lived in huge houses, others in cramped corners. Some ate well, others went hungry. Some made the rules. Others had to follow. This pattern never fully went away. The gap between rich and poor, the fight for fairness, the question of who gets what. These struggles started early, and they're still with us. The real lesson here isn't just that cities can be unfair. It's that city life forces people to notice these things. When everyone lives close together, you can't ignore your neighbours. Problems become visible. The first protests, the first reforms, the first attempts to change the rules. These all started in the city streets. Even now, change often begins in cities, because that's where people see each other's struggles up close. Let's talk about something else. The way cities link people across space and time. When the first trade routes connected one city to another, it was like building a bridge to a new world. Goods, ideas, and even diseases moved fast. But so did music, art, and new ways of thinking. Cities became engines for mixing and sharing. They turned differences into something powerful. Fast forward to now. The internet connects us even faster, but the pattern is the same. Cities are still hubs where ideas bump into each other, where people from everywhere meet and mix. The first cities taught us that being connected is both a risk and a gift. Sometimes trouble spreads faster because of those links, but so does help, so do good ideas. The key is learning to handle both. Here's the thing about the old city builders. They were always dealing with the unknown. Every year something new could show up. A strange new crop, a wild animal, a visitor from far away. Sometimes these changes brought danger. Sometimes they brought hope. The cities that welcomed outsiders, that learned from strangers, often did better in the long run. The ones that shut their doors too tightly missed out. It's tempting to think that the past was simple and the present is complicated. But that's not really true. The first cities were full of surprises, stress, and change. They had to invent answers on the fly. We're doing the same thing now, just with different tools. When you walk down a busy street or scroll through news from around the world, you're living with the same mix of risk and opportunity. Let's look at what happens when cities fall. It's easy to see only the loss, abandoned houses, lost art, broken walls. But the story doesn't end there. People move on. They carry memories, skills, and stories with them. Sometimes they start new towns or join other groups. The knowledge from a fallen city doesn't just vanish. It gets reused, reshaped, and passed on. Even when cities disappear, their influence lingers for centuries. That's why when we dig up old ruins, we sometimes find hints of old city habits in places far away. Pottery shapes, words, farming tricks, and even recipes travelled along with the people. The end of a city was rarely the end of its story. It was just a new beginning, somewhere else. This brings us to something big. Cities make the world feel both bigger and smaller at the same time. In a city, you can meet people you'd never see in a village. You can try new foods, hear new languages, and see new inventions. But you're also part of a crowd, woven into a web of connections that can stretch for miles. That mix of freedom and belonging is one of the city's oldest gifts. But here's a question. Why do we keep building cities, even after seeing so many rise and fall? Part of the answer is hope. Cities are bets on the future. They're built on the belief that together, people can solve problems, make life better, and leave something behind. The ruins remind us it doesn't always work out. But they also show that the dream never really dies. People always come back, try again, and build something new. There's also the simple truth that cities make things possible that can't happen anywhere else. Big art, big science, big dreams. You need lots of people sharing ideas and skills to build a pyramid or invent writing or map the stars. Even now, the biggest breakthroughs, new medicines, new tech, new art, often start in busy city centres. But let's not sugarcoat it. Cities demand a lot. They ask people to give up some privacy, to share space, to follow rules. They can be loud, crowded, and stressful. Some days it feels like too much, but that's the trade-off. The same crowd that makes life complicated also makes it rich. The same rules that feel strict can also keep you safe. It's a balancing act, and it always has been. Now, let's think about how the story of the first cities changes the way we see our own time. When we face problems, climate, health, conflict, it's tempting to think we're on our own, but we're not. We're part of a long chain of people who face the same kinds of troubles. They didn't have all the answers.